She spent her entire career teaching women how to survive violent men. Dr. Amie Harwick was a prominent Hollywood therapist, an expert in domestic abuse, and a fierce protector of the vulnerable. She understood the psychology of a stalker better than almost anyone. Yet, on a cool February night in 2020, that deep professional expertise could not save her. Forced over the edge of her own third-story balcony, she plummeted 20 feet to her death. The legal system designed to protect her had simply expired, and her killer just waited it out. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Amie Harwick was born in 1981 in a working-class Pennsylvania neighborhood, far removed from the manicured lawns of Southern California. She relocated to Los Angeles in her early 20s, driven by a sharp, calculating ambition to reinvent herself. Unlike the thousands who migrate west chasing screen time, Amie's focus was ruthlessly academic. She financed her early education through alternative modeling and working within the local nightlife and entertainment sectors, a gritty, exhausting grind that exposed her to the raw, often exploitative underbelly of the city. That demanding environment did not harden her. Instead, it cultivated a profound analytical empathy for vulnerable individuals, particularly women navigating predatory environments. Her academic trajectory was relentless. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from California Polytechnic State University, followed immediately by a master's degree from Pepperdine University in clinical psychology. She eventually secured a doctorate, officially becoming a licensed marriage and family therapist. Dr. Harwick carved out a highly specific, vital niche in West Hollywood, focusing extensively on sex therapy, domestic battery, and psychological abuse recovery. She authored a comprehensive clinical book on the subject and rapidly became a sought-after expert on podcasts and television panels. Her private practice on Santa Monica Boulevard functioned as a sanctuary for victims of intimate partner violence. Day after day, Amie sat in a quiet, soundproofed room, deconstructing the anatomy of obsession for her traumatized clients. She explicitly taught them how to identify behavioral red flags, how to distinguish genuine affection from pathological control. She detailed the exact mechanisms stalkers use to isolate their targets, mapping out the escalation from unwanted texts to physical intimidation. The bitter, inescapable paradox is that the very pathology she spent thousands of clinical hours dissecting would soon breach the walls of her own personal life. Living and operating in Los Angeles as a prominent media-facing professional inherently strips away layers of anonymity. Amie's visibility was vital for the growth of her practice, but it left her chronically exposed. In the modern digital age, a public profile equates to a permanent, trackable footprint. Her office address, her media appearances, her social circles, everything was readily accessible to anyone with an internet connection. To counteract this digital vulnerability, she heavily fortified her physical reality. She purchased a beautiful, multi-level home tucked away in the Hollywood Hills. The property was an oasis, yet she methodically outfitted it with advanced security cameras, high-definition motion sensors, and reinforced locks on every access point. Amie understood the raw, terrifying data regarding violence against women. She counseled her patients daily that temporary restraining orders were often nothing more than fragile pieces of paper, bureaucratic shields that could not stop a determined aggressor. She did not live in a state of paralyzing paranoia, but she operated with an elite level of situational awareness. She structured her daily routines to minimize risk, documenting unwanted contacts and strictly advising against any engagement with provocations. She knew the psychology of a predator inside and out. She knew that stalkers thrive on a distorted sense of ownership, feeding on the fear and disruption they cause in their victim's routine. Yet, the fundamental flaw in the legal framework is that it forces the victim into a state of perpetual vigilance, while the aggressor only needs a single window of opportunity. Amie's vast expertise provided her with the intellectual tools to predict dangerous behavior, but psychological profiling alone cannot block a physical breach. She had built her entire professional identity around empowering survivors to escape the exact type of lethal obsession that was currently mapping out her own neighborhood, watching her movements, and waiting for a legal protective order to expire. The timeline pulls back to the winter of 2011. Before the doctorate, before the thriving Santa Monica practice, Amie attended an industry awards event in Los Angeles. It was a chaotic, sensory-heavy environment. Pulsing strobes, heavy bass rattling the floorboards, a dense crowd of industry professionals and peripheral hangers-on. Among the event photographers was Gareth Pursehouse. He was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 4 inches, working the room with his heavy camera rig. Their paths intersected. The initial interaction was entirely unremarkable, a standard exchange in a room built for transient networking. He took her picture. They spoke briefly. A relationship formed shortly after, but it was fundamentally fractured from its inception. To outside observers, it appeared to be a standard, perhaps slightly mismatched, Los Angeles pairing. Amie was intensely driven, meticulously mapping out her academic and professional future. Pursehouse, conversely, lacked any forward momentum. He worked freelance technical and photography gigs, existing comfortably on the margins of the entertainment industry. The stark disparity in their ambitions created immediate friction, but the true rot within the dynamic was much deeper. Psychological abuse rarely announces itself with a closed fist. It creeps in quietly, often disguised as deep concern, passion, or a protective instinct. Pursehouse began mapping her boundaries, testing their structural integrity daily. It started with incessant, suffocating text messages when she was away. He demanded constant, real-time updates regarding her location, her companions, and her schedule. If she failed to respond within a narrow, arbitrary window, his messages would abruptly pivot from needy to aggressive. He monitored her digital footprint with clinical precision. This was early in the decade, a time when social media was cementing itself as an unavoidable professional requirement. For Amie, an online presence was mandatory for networking and career growth. For Pursehouse, it was a surveillance grid. He heavily scrutinized her interactions, aggressively questioning her about male colleagues who commented on her posts or attended the same industry events. The jealousy rapidly mutated into absolute possession. By early 2012, the dynamic had deteriorated into active hostility. Amie recognized the toxic architecture of the relationship and attempted to sever ties. That is when the true anatomy of his obsession revealed itself. Rejection did not make him retreat. It activated a relentless, desperate pursuit. Pursehouse simply refused to accept the breakup. He began showing up uninvited at her apartment complex. He loitered in the dim parking lot, sitting in his vehicle for hours, his eyes fixed on her windows. The emotional manipulation quickly escalated into physical intimidation. During one terrifying confrontation, he forced his way into her unit and initiated a systematic destruction of her property. He shattered lamps. He hurled heavy picture frames against the drywall. He completely destroyed her television. The violence was specifically directed at her environment, a classic intimidation tactic designed to demonstrate exactly what he was capable of doing to her physically. The sharp crack of breaking plastic and the dull thud of objects hitting the floor served as a sensory warning. Amie documented the wreckage. She took clear photographs of the shattered glass, quietly building a file that would later support her legal pleas. In June of 2012, the situation reached a critical breaking point. Pursehouse physically assaulted her. He shoved her forcefully to the floor during an argument, resulting in severe bruising and a profound realization that her life was in active danger. Amie immediately filed for a temporary restraining order, detailing the assault, the relentless stalking, and the destruction of her personal property. In the court documents, she explicitly stated her deep-seated fear that he would end her life. The legal system responded by granting the order. He was officially mandated to stay away. For a brief period, the court order acted as a functional deterrent. She sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Los Angeles courthouse, securing a legal barrier that allowed her to breathe. But restraining orders possess a fatal flaw. They have expiration dates. The initial mandate was extended, ultimately stretching all the way to 2015. During those highly stressful years, Amie worked exhaustively to erase herself from his radar. She moved to a new address. She heavily altered her daily routines. She plunged entirely into her clinical studies, actively using the severe trauma of that relationship to inform her therapeutic work. She took the raw fear he instilled in her and weaponized it into a brilliant career designed to protect others. As years passed without any physical contact, the immediate threat seemed to neutralize. The legal shield finally expired. In the eyes of the law, the conflict was entirely resolved. The bureaucratic timer had simply run out, erasing the invisible boundaries that kept him at bay. Amie moved forward, building an incredibly successful life, assuming that dark chapter was firmly buried. But obsession does not obey judicial timelines. It ferments in the dark. While Amie was publishing her comprehensive book and appearing on national television, Pursehouse was sinking deeper into a stagnant, bitter reality. He maintained a quiet, invisible vigilance. He watched her rapid ascent from a distance, tracking her success through glowing screens. The legal expiration did not mean he had moved on. It simply meant he no longer had to hide in the shadows. Mid-January 2020. The sprawling hotel complex in downtown Los Angeles hosted the annual X-Biz Awards, a massive, high-energy gala for the adult entertainment industry. Amie attended the event strictly in a professional capacity, networking within her specific clinical demographic. The venue was an assault on the senses. Heavy bass vibrated through the floorboards, erratic strobe lights cut through the dim ballroom, and hundreds of industry professionals packed the aisles. She navigated the chaotic environment with her usual polished confidence. Then, the absolute worst-case scenario materialized. Working the event as a freelance photographer, blending into the swarm of media personnel, was her former abuser. The mathematics of the encounter were highly improbable, yet their paths intersected directly in the center of the crowded hall. The passage of 8 years had done absolutely nothing to dilute his fixation. Observers noted that his psychological collapse was instantaneous and severe. He did not behave like a man bumping into a distant ex-partner. He reacted with the raw, hyperventilating volatility of an open wound. He aggressively blocked her path. His breathing became erratic, his face flushed, and his hands trembled violently. He loudly accused her of ruining his life, his voice cracking with a disturbing blend of rage and desperate entitlement. He demanded closure. He insisted she owed him an explanation for the agonizing pain he claimed to have endured since their legal severing in 2012. He caused a highly localized, deeply uncomfortable spectacle, entirely disregarding the social constraints of the formal gala. Amie relied instantly on her extensive clinical training to de-escalate the immediate physical threat. She kept her tone remarkably level, attempting to neutralize his escalating aggression just enough to secure a physical exit route. She firmly stated she would not engage in this environment, broke eye contact, and rapidly maneuvered through the dense crowd, leaving the venue altogether. But beneath her ironclad professional composure, sheer panic took root. The adrenaline flooded her system. As she drove the miles back to the Hollywood Hills, the terrifying reality settled in. She recognized the exact behavioral markers of a stalker re-engaging. The emotional dam had broken. The dormant obsession was completely reactivated, and worse, the restraining order was long dead. The ensuing weeks were defined by a suffocating, unrelenting dread. Amie explicitly communicated her terror to her closest circle, stating plainly that she believed she was being hunted. She understood the mechanics of his pathology perfectly. That random, chaotic meeting had provided him with a fresh hit of the control he craved. The timer had reset. She immediately went to work hardening her physical environment. Her multi-level home, built into the steep incline of a canyon road, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated trap. The architectural features that made the property desirable, expansive glass doors, secluded outdoor spaces, and a sweeping third-story balcony perched roughly 20 feet above the ground, now felt like massive structural vulnerabilities. She tested the deadbolts nightly. She checked the window latches repeatedly. She installed secondary locks on the patio doors. She sent out group messages to trusted friends detailing his erratic behavior at the awards show, intentionally creating a digital paper trail of her escalating anxiety. She shared her live GPS location with her inner circle, a grim precaution for a woman who knew exactly how these patterns typically end. The psychological toll was devastating. Sleep deprivation set in. In the total silence of the Los Angeles canyons, every ambient noise became a potential threat. The snapping of a dry branch, the rush of wind against the glass, the crunch of gravel near the driveway. The most agonizing aspect of the escalation was the complete legal paralysis. When she inquired about reinstating the protective order, the bureaucratic reality proved entirely useless. A verbal confrontation in a public place, no matter how deeply unhinged or psychologically scarring, did not legally constitute a new, prosecutable physical threat. The justice system required fresh violence. She was trapped in the lethal blind spot of stalking laws, forced to wait for an overt crime to occur before the police could intervene. She was completely exposed, and out in the dark, he was mapping the perimeter. February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day in Los Angeles. The temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, a crisp winter night for Southern California. Amie chose to spend the evening out with a close group of friends at a burlesque show in West Hollywood. It was a conscious decision to reclaim her routine, to override the ambient dread that had dictated her movements for weeks. Photographs from that night show her relaxed, wearing a black dress, seemingly insulated from the threat tracking her geographic coordinates. She left the venue after midnight. The drive back into the Hollywood Hills was a familiar transition from the neon saturation of the city into the dense, unlit, winding roads of her canyon neighborhood. The absolute isolation of these enclaves is their primary selling point. Houses are built into the steep hillsides, shielded by thick vegetation and high retaining walls. At night, the acoustics of the canyon dampen ambient noise entirely. Amie pulled into her driveway at approximately 1:15 a.m. on February 15th. The property was a multi-level structure. Her roommate, Michael, occupied the ground floor bedroom. Amie's living quarters, including the master suite and the sprawling exterior balcony, were located on the third level. The sequence of the next 45 minutes was reconstructed entirely through forensic evidence, blood-spattered geometry, and auditory memory. She unlocked the front door and moved through the silent house. Michael was asleep downstairs. Amie walked up the carpeted stairs to her bedroom. She changed out of her evening clothes and into comfortable loungewear. Everything appeared routine, but the perimeter had already been breached. Investigators later determined that the intruder bypassed the exterior security measures and gained access through a glass French door on the lower level. The entry was forced, but highly calculated. The glass panes near the locking mechanism had been deliberately shattered, allowing a hand to reach through and disengage the internal deadbolt. From there, the stalker navigated a dark, unfamiliar floor plan. He bypassed the sleeping roommate entirely, moving vertically through the property, heading straight for the third floor. He was already inside the house, waiting in the dark while she was driving home. The precise moment the ambush was initiated remains locked in the timeline, but the sudden explosion of violence shattered the absolute quiet of the canyon. Down on the first floor, Michael woke instantly. The ceiling above him vibrated. He heard heavy, chaotic footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors upstairs. It was not the sound of a routine argument. It was the distinct, terrifying cadence of a severe physical struggle. Bodies colliding with drywall, heavy furniture being violently shoved across the room. Then, the screams began. Michael later detailed to authorities that he heard Amie yelling. She was screaming for her life. The vocalization was desperate, raw, and indicative of a profound, immediate threat. He leaped out of bed and rushed into the hallway. The stairwell was completely dark. He stood at the base of the stairs, listening to the horrifying acoustics of his friend fighting a losing battle against a massive physical advantage. He searched frantically for his cell phone in the dark to call for help, but in the panic of waking up to a nightmare, his hands swept over empty tables. He could not locate the device. He yelled up the stairwell, attempting to distract the attacker, demanding to know what was happening above him. The response from the third floor was not a voice, but the sickening sound of a heavy body hitting the floorboards. Michael faced an agonizing, split-second calculation. He was unarmed. The narrow staircase was a fatal choke point. Whoever was upstairs had completely overwhelmed Amie, meaning the attacker was violently dangerous and possessed a severe size advantage. If Michael ascended those stairs blind, he would likely become the second casualty, leaving absolutely no one to contact law enforcement. His only viable tactical option was to secure outside help immediately. He abandoned the search for his phone and sprinted for the front door, but the property's security features The exact elements designed to keep threats out now trapped him inside. In his panic, he struggled with the complex deadbolts. Adrenaline severely compromised his fine motor skills. Realizing the front exit was taking too long, he bolted toward the back patio. Michael scaled the perimeter wall. He dropped down into the neighboring yard and began running through the neighborhood. The Hollywood Hills at 1:30 a.m. are a void. There is zero pedestrian traffic. The homes are fortress-like, set far back from the winding asphalt behind heavy iron gates. He pounded on the heavy wooden doors of adjacent houses. He screamed into the void for someone to wake up, to call the police, to open their gates. House after house remained completely dark. Minutes were bleeding away. Every second he spent sprinting barefoot down the abrasive road was a second Amie was fighting alone. Finally, he encountered a neighbor walking down the street, a rare anomaly at that hour. Michael frantically explained the situation, stating that his roommate was being violently assaulted and they required law enforcement immediately. A call was finally placed to 911. While Michael was desperately trying to navigate the geographic dead zone of the canyon to secure help, the violence on the third floor was reaching its absolute climax. Forensic reconstruction indicates a brutal, prolonged confrontation. Amie did not submit. She fought back with immense ferocity. The master bedroom became a contained arena of survival. A heavy television was completely ripped from its wall, mounting and smashed onto the floor. Large patches of drywall were dented and punctured. A string of rosary beads was torn from a surface, the beads scattering across the hardwood. Blood evidence mapped a linear trajectory of resistance. Smears on the door frames indicated an attempt to escape the room. Broken acrylic nails were recovered from the floorboards, a grim testament to her desperate attempts to claw at her attacker's face and arms. The intruder possessed a nearly 100-pound weight advantage. The physics of the assault were brutally asymmetrical. Medical examiners later discovered deep defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Severe contusions encircled her neck, forming distinct petechial patterns that matched manual strangulation. The cartilage in her throat was fractured. The physical evidence proved that before gravity became the lethal instrument, she was choked to the absolute point of unconsciousness. The attacker managed to force her toward the balcony. The drop from the edge of that third-story ledge to the concrete patio below was approximately 20 feet. The balcony itself featured a standard wrought iron railing standing approximately 40 inches high. It was engineered to prevent accidental falls. A grown woman does not simply trip over a barrier of that height. The trajectory of her descent, the exact distance her body landed from the base of the stucco wall, indicated that she was either propelled forcefully over the ironwork or dropped while she was completely incapacitated. The impact with the ground was catastrophic. A 20-foot fall onto solid concrete generates immense kinetic energy. Silence finally returned to the canyon. The intruder made his exit, slipping back out into the dark labyrinth of the hills, leaving the property exactly as the police would soon find it, a scene of total devastation. At 1:16 a.m., the Los Angeles Police Department received the emergency dispatch regarding a woman screaming in a Hollywood Hills residence. Patrol vehicles navigated the winding roads, their sirens cutting through the night air. They arrived at the property shortly after Michael managed to flag down the neighbor. Officers breached the security gate. Flashlights swept the exterior of the house. Before they even entered the shattered lower-level door or climbed the stairs to witness the destruction of the master suite, their beams caught a form lying on the ground beneath the third-story balcony. Amie was located on the cold concrete patio. She was entirely unresponsive. Her body had absorbed massive blunt force trauma. Her physical state was entirely consistent with a high-velocity impact from a significant vertical drop. The responding officers radioed for immediate medical transport. The paramedics arrived within minutes, initiating trauma protocols right there on the concrete. They worked under the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. The patio quickly became marked with medical debris, discarded gauze, IV wrappings, and the sterile packaging of emergency trauma gear. Despite the catastrophic nature of the fall and the severe injuries sustained during the struggle upstairs, she was still breathing. Her heart was still beating. She was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The transport involved navigating back down those same treacherous canyon roads at maximum speed. Every pothole and sharp turn complicated the medics' efforts to maintain a stable airway. The medical personnel worked aggressively to stabilize her vitals, fighting against severe internal bleeding and profound cranial trauma. But the physics of the fall and the preceding violence had inflicted irreversible damage. The blunt force trauma had compromised her skeletal structure and internal organs beyond the threshold of surgical repair. Shortly after arriving at the emergency room trauma bay, the clinical team exhausted all intervention options. Dr. Amie Harwick was pronounced dead. By the time the sun crested over the Hollywood Hills on that Saturday morning, the property on Mound Street had been entirely cordoned off by yellow police tape. The Los Angeles Police Department's elite robbery homicide division took control of the site. What they found inside was a blueprint of calculated malice masked initially as a chaotic home invasion. The first tactical sweep of the lower level revealed the shattered French door. Glass fragments were scattered across the expensive rugs, but the detectives immediately noted a glaring inconsistency. Nothing of value had been removed. High-end electronics, designer items, and cash were completely untouched. The intruder had bypassed every easily fenced item on the ground floor and moved with singular, vertical purpose toward the master suite. This was not a burglary. It was an execution. Forensic teams painstakingly documented the third-floor bedroom. The sheer scale of the destruction mapped out a desperate fight for survival. Blood droplets formed a chaotic constellation across the hardwood, leading directly toward the open balcony doors. But amid the overturned furniture and punctured drywall, investigators discovered a piece of evidence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the entire case. Lying discarded on the floor near the balcony threshold was a plastic syringe. It was fully loaded with a clear, yellowish liquid. Subsequent toxicology reports would reveal the substance to be a highly concentrated, lethal dose of liquid nicotine. This single piece of plastic elevated the crime from a spontaneous act of rage into a cold, meticulously premeditated assassination. The medical examiner's analysis suggested a terrifying theoretical timeline. The intruder had brought the syringe with the explicit intent of injecting the victim, likely planning to stage the death as a bizarre, untraceable overdose or medical anomaly. Nicotine poisoning in such high concentrations induces rapid paralysis and respiratory failure. But the target had fought back with such unforeseen ferocity that the attacker was forced to abandon his chemical weapon, resorting instead to manual strangulation and gravity. Down at the precinct, the surviving roommate sat in a sterile interview room, recounting the nightmare to lead detectives. He explained the timeline of the screams, the heavy impacts shaking the ceiling, and his frantic sprint through the dark neighborhood to secure help. When asked if the victim had any known enemies, the investigation experienced an immediate, massive acceleration. The detectives did not have to conduct a blind manhunt. The victim had effectively solved her own homicide weeks before it occurred. Her digital footprint provided a flawless map pointing directly to the killer. Investigators accessed her recent communications, uncovering the desperate emails, the shared GPS tracking links, and the detailed messages sent to friends regarding the terrifying encounter at the industry awards show. The expired restraining order from 2012 was pulled from the county archives. The suspect pool instantly shrank to a single name. The manhunt for the former photographer began before noon. The midpoint of the investigation was defined by a tense, agonizing waiting game. Law enforcement initially feared the suspect had utilized the hours between the 911 call and daylight to flee the state or cross the international border into Mexico. Tactical units staked out his known addresses, anticipating a heavily armed standoff. Surveillance teams monitored a quiet coastal neighborhood in Playa del Rey, roughly 20 miles south of the crime scene. They located his vehicle parked outside his residence. He had not run. He had simply driven home and gone to sleep. On the afternoon of February 15th, an FBI and LAPD joint task force descended on the Playa del Rey property. Heavily armed operators breached the perimeter and apprehended the suspect without a violent incident. Observers noted that his demeanor during the arrest was strangely passive, entirely disconnected from the brutal kinetic energy unleashed in the canyon just hours prior. He was transported to downtown Los Angeles for booking, while the suspect sat in a holding cell, A massive social echo reverberated through West Hollywood. The news of the tragedy broke across local and national media networks, instantly paralyzing the local therapeutic community. The victim's former patients, dozens of women actively fleeing domestic violence and severe abuse, spiraled into absolute panic. The psychological fallout was devastating. The stark, undeniable reality was that an elite specialist, a woman who possessed every intellectual tool and security measure available, had been hunted down in her own home. Advocacy groups and fellow clinicians publicly voiced their terror, noting that if the system could not protect the expert, the system was entirely broken. The legal machinery, however, soon delivered another shocking blow to that terrified community. Within days of his arrest, the suspect utilized a bail bondsman to post a staggering $2 million bond. Because the initial charges did not yet include certain specialized legal enhancements, the system permitted his temporary release. He walked out of the county jail. The resulting outrage was swift and furious. A man accused of scaling a Hollywood Hills balcony and orchestrating an assassination was suddenly back on the streets of Los Angeles. Lawmakers and public figures demanded immediate intervention. The district attorney's office scrambled to correct the bureaucratic nightmare. Prosecutors aggressively restructured the case, gathering the forensic evidence of the shattered door, the lethal syringe, and the digital paper trail to secure a new, ironclad warrant. They formally refiled the charges, adding the special circumstance of lying in wait. This specific legal enhancement drastically increased the severity of the indictment, making the crime a capital offense. A specialized tactical unit was immediately dispatched back to Playa del Rey. The suspect was rearrested on a no-bail warrant. The heavy iron doors of the Los Angeles County Jail slammed shut, this time locking from the outside permanently. The physical threat was finally neutralized, but the agonizing crawl toward a criminal trial was just beginning. The judicial machinery ground slowly, heavily delayed by global events and endless procedural motions. The trial officially commenced in late August 2023, more than 3 years after the Hollywood Hills perimeter was breached. The courtroom environment was severely clinical, a stark contrast to the emotional devastation the crime had inflicted on the Los Angeles therapeutic community. Prosecutors systematically dismantled the defense's primary narrative. The accused's legal team attempted to frame the fatal night as a spontaneous, tragic accident, a desperate plea for emotional closure that escalated out of control. They argued there was no premeditated intent to kill. The state countered this narrative by directing the jury's attention to the lethal plastic tube recovered from the master suite. A fully loaded nicotine syringe is not an item brought to a conversation regarding closure. It is an instrument of calculated execution. Forensic specialists detailed the DNA material recovered from beneath the victim's broken acrylic nails, confirming the desperate physical struggle that preceded the fall. The psychological profiling presented to the court was chilling. It bypassed the concept of a sudden emotional snap, outlining instead a deep, festering narcissistic injury. The obsession was fueled by an absolute refusal to accept a loss of control. The jury did not struggle with the evidence. In September 2023, after less than 2 days of deliberation, they returned their decision. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder, explicitly including the special circumstance of lying in wait. 3 months later, the presiding judge delivered the ultimate procedural finality. The perpetrator was sentenced to life in a California state penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The gavel dropped, securing a permanent physical barrier that the expired legal paperwork could not. Yet, the resolution offered a bitter emptiness. A dangerous man was permanently removed from society, but the core systemic failure remained entirely unaddressed. She had possessed a profound elite understanding of predatory psychology. She tirelessly educated vulnerable individuals on how to recognize the encroaching shadow of a stalker. When the threat targeted her directly, she executed every recommended protocol. She fortified her environment and documented the harassment. The tragedy lies in the brutal realization that she did absolutely everything right. The legal framework designed to shield her operated under a fatal delusion, the assumption that pathological obsession obeys an artificial expiration date. The bureaucracy treated a violent fixation as a temporary condition. The system demanded new, prosecutable violence before it would re-engage its protective mechanisms. She recognized the danger the moment the silent perimeter was crossed. She knew the psychological timer had reset, but the law required her to wait until the glass was shattered. By the time that violent threshold was met, the only protection left was a drop into the dark. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A 54-year-old fashion boutique owner walked out the front door of her million-dollar suburban mansion to clear her head and simply evaporated into the cold air. She left behind a fiercely loyal daughter and a husband who calmly watched her leave. The pristine silence of this affluent neighborhood wasn't hiding a sudden, voluntary disappearance. It was masking a calculated execution. The architect of that fatal morning didn't have to break in. He already held the keys. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Dellen Ristevski engineered her reality from the ground up. For decades, she operated as the beating heart and the relentless engine of her family. To the outside world, she projected an image of effortless, untouchable elegance. She owned and operated a string of high-end fashion boutiques named Bella Blue, anchored in the bustling retail hubs of suburban Melbourne. The stores were meticulously curated temples of luxury, racks of imported silk, polished chrome display fixtures, and the faint, persistent scent of expensive floral perfume. Customers saw a fiercely successful businesswoman who drove a sleek black Mercedes-Benz SLK coupe and retreated every evening to a sprawling property in Avondale Heights. It was a neighborhood defined by manicured lawns, tall privacy fences, and quiet wealth. But the glossy exterior of the Ristevski lifestyle was a dangerously thin veneer stretched over a rotting foundation. Behind the polished storefronts, Bella Bleu was bleeding out. While Dellen was the undisputed face of the operation, charming clients, selecting inventory, and working exhaustive hours on the retail floor, her husband, Borce, managed the back office. He was supposed to be the financial anchor. He kept the books, handled the logistics, and dealt with the accounts. Instead, he was the leak in the hull. Under his unregulated stewardship, the couple's retail empire was suffocating under a massive, undeclared mountain of debt. By the winter of 2016, their financial reality was completely incompatible with the affluent illusion they broadcast to their neighbors. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red. Credit lines were completely exhausted. Unpaid suppliers were calling daily. The stress of maintaining the Avondale Heights facade was immense, and the physical toll fell almost entirely on Dellen. She was pulling grueling 50-hour work weeks just to service the interest on loans Borce had repeatedly assured her were under control. Her exhaustion was masked by expensive makeup and a sharp, professional smile. The psychological contrast between husband and wife was jarring. Dellen was pragmatic, direct, and aggressively unwilling to accept failure. When she saw a problem, she confronted it head-on. Borce operated in the shadows of her ambition. He possessed a passive, evasive demeanor that allowed him to blend into the background. While Dellen fought furiously on the sales floor to plug the financial holes, Borce sat behind a desk, minimizing the damage and offering empty, placating reassurances. He was a man who preferred to cover his eyes when the warning lights started flashing. This dynamic turned their large, echoey mansion into a slow-boiling pressure cooker. The quiet rooms of the home became a battleground of whispered arguments and slammed doors. The tension was no longer just about money, it was about betrayal. Dellen was a woman who demanded control, and she was waking up to the terrifying realization that the man she had trusted with her life's work had driven them to the edge of a sheer cliff. She began digging into the ledgers herself, intercepting the mail, scrutinizing the bank statements Borce had kept hidden. The shift in the household power dynamic was imminent. Dellen was preparing to strip her husband of his financial access, cutting him out of the administrative side of the business entirely to save whatever was left of her legacy. The facade was finally cracking, and Borce, a man who had spent years hiding his failures behind his wife's relentless success, was running out of dark corners. The union between Borce and Karen wasn't born from a sudden, volatile spark. It was a 25-year entrenchment. They met in their early 20s, long before the designer clothes and the luxury cars. Back then, they were just two people trying to carve out a living in the working-class suburbs. Karen was the ambitious visionary. Borce presented himself as the grounded, stabilizing force, the heavy anchor to her soaring ambition. For a long time, the arrangement worked. They built a life side by side, moving from modest beginnings to the sprawling, multi-level home in Avondale Heights. But as the decades wore on, the psychological architecture of their marriage warped. Karen evolved. She grew into a sharp, formidable presence who commanded respect on the retail floor and expected perfection. Borce stagnated. He grew dangerously comfortable, operating in the cool shade of his wife's success. He absorbed the benefits of her grueling labor, the tailored suits, the imported vehicles, the social status, while contributing less and less to the actual foundation holding it all up. Borce didn't conquer the business world. He merely occupied a desk within Karen's empire. His primary skill wasn't financial management. It was conflict avoidance. He developed a coward's talent for hiding bad news, shuffling papers, and offering hollow reassurances just to keep the peace for one more day. The only pure, uncontested space in their deteriorating marriage was their daughter, Sarah. She was the absolute center of their universe, the single point of gravity that kept the Ristevski household from spinning out of orbit. Karen's devotion to her daughter was fierce and absolute. Everything the businesswoman endured, the 50-hour weeks, the mounting stress, the exhaustion, was designed to ensure Sarah never had to understand the mechanics of survival. Borce, too, was a fiercely dedicated father. To Sarah, her parents presented an impenetrable, unified front. She saw the Sunday dinners, the family vacations, the quiet moments of domestic routine. She never saw the rotting floorboards beneath her feet because Karen and Borce made a silent pact to shield her from the truth. Sarah was their shared masterpiece. But there was a severe counterweight to Sarah's perfection, a source of constant, grating friction that slowly ground the marriage down to dust. His name was Anthony. Anthony Rickard was Borce's son from a previous relationship. He was the chaotic, destructive element introduced into Karen's highly ordered world. While Karen meticulously curated every aspect of her life, Anthony brought nothing but instability. His timeline was jagged with severe drug addiction, erratic behavior, and legal entanglements. Borce possessed neither the spine nor the authority to manage his troubled son. Instead, he enabled him. This dynamic forced Karen into a role she despised. She became the reluctant financier for a grown man's chronic failures. Thousands of dollars were quietly siphoned from the family's already bleeding accounts to cover Anthony's debts, post bail, or pay for rehabilitation stints that never took hold. Borce couldn't say no to his son, so he simply hid the cost from his wife. When Karen inevitably discovered the missing funds, the arguments that echoed through their massive home were vicious. She wasn't just angry about the money, she was infuriated by the weakness of the man sitting across from her. Borce was sacrificing her life's work to plug the endless holes in his son's disastrous life. The financial infidelity became a slow-acting poison. By early 2016, the marriage was entirely transactional. The affection had been replaced by a cold, simmering hostility. They moved through their large house like ghosts, occupying separate rooms, avoiding eye contact, and communicating only regarding the logistics of the boutique or Sarah's schedule. The air inside the home was thick with unspoken ultimatums. Karen was not a woman who surrendered to a sinking ship. She was a problem solver, and she had finally identified the core problem. Borce wasn't just useless. He was an active threat to her survival. The forensic accountants who later tore through the family's history noted a distinct shift in Karen's behavior in the months leading up to that final winter. She was quietly gathering the reins. She began demanding raw bank statements. She started questioning suppliers directly, bypassing Borce's filtered reports. She was preparing to execute a complete financial severing. She wasn't necessarily plotting a messy public divorce that would tarnish the pristine image she had spent a quarter-century building for Sarah. Instead, she was going to systematically strip Borce of all access, authority, and control. She was going to demote him in his own life. For a man whose entire identity and ego were completely dependent on the illusion of being a successful manager, this impending loss of control was an existential threat. Borce had spent 25 years hiding his failures behind his wife's relentless competence. Now, the lights were coming on, and there was nowhere left to hide. The pressure inside the house had finally reached critical mass. The valve was about to blow. Wednesday, June 29th, 2016, broke with a bitter, biting chill over the Melbourne suburbs. The temperature hovered in the low 40s Fahrenheit, and a thin layer of frost clung to the immaculate, highly manicured lawns of Avondale Heights. Inside the sprawling home, the morning routine proceeded with the mechanical precision required of a family maintaining a flawless facade. Sarah, 21 years old and completely oblivious to the terminal state of her parents' marriage, prepared for her shift at the boutique. She moved through the high-end kitchen, gathering her belongings, finalizing her schedule. She directed her goodbyes to the room. Her father sat nearby, quiet and passive. Her mother was already dressed for the day, projecting her usual unyielding focus. Sarah walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind her. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. That metallic snap signaled the removal of the household's only buffer. The audience was gone. The couple was entirely alone. What transpired in the ensuing minutes remains locked inside a silent house, but the forensic timeline paints a suffocating, violent picture. The confrontation was immediate. The businesswoman cornered her husband over the terminal state of their finances. She demanded a full, unvarnished accounting of the missing capital, the phantom ledgers, the unpaid suppliers, the thousands of dollars quietly siphoned away to fund his son's chaotic, destructive lifestyle. She informed him that his tenure as the financial manager of her empire was permanently terminated. She was seizing total, absolute control of the accounts. He pushed back. He offered his usual deflections, attempting to minimize the catastrophic debt and shift the blame. She refused to accept the placation. The argument escalated rapidly, not into a screaming match that would alert the neighbors, but into quiet, vicious, close-quarters warfare. It was the sound of a 25-year partnership snapping cleanly in half. Then, the timeline abruptly fractures. The argument ceased. The house fell completely silent. When detectives later asked the husband to recount the morning, he delivered a perfectly rehearsed, sterile narrative. He stated that the financial discussion simply hit a wall. He claimed she grew visibly agitated, announced she needed to clear her head, and walked out the front door on foot at approximately 10 a.m. He told investigators he watched her go, assuming she would cool off and return in a few hours to resume her shift. It was a story built on sand. The psychological profile of the missing woman actively rejected his sequence of events. She was a deeply pragmatic, highly image-conscious business owner who never missed a shift and never abandoned control. Walking out into the freezing wind to wander the suburban sidewalks was entirely out of character. More damning was what she allegedly left behind. Her designer purse remained on the kitchen counter. Her wallet was untouched. Her car keys were still in the house. Most impossibly, her cell phone was gone, but it wasn't walking down the street. He claimed he spent the next few hours pacing the house, waiting for her to return. When she didn't materialize, he decided to take her prized vehicle, the black Mercedes-Benz SLK Coupe, for a drive. He told detectives the car had a faulty fuel gauge, and he wanted to test it on the freeway to ensure it was safe for her to drive later. The husband's narrative survived exactly as long as it took authorities to pull the digital data. The invisible web of cell towers and surveillance lenses over the city told a radically different, terrifyingly precise story. Her cell phone never walked out the front door at 10 a.m. The device registered a steady connection to the local tower, remaining entirely stationary inside the house. It sat in a localized ping radius while the argument raged, and it stayed there during the heavy, unexplained silence that followed. At 10:43 a.m., the digital footprint violently shifted. The engine of the black SLK Coupe turned over in the garage. The heavy, insulated trunk, a space just barely large enough to conceal a human form, was slammed shut. The vibration sensors and onboard computer of the German luxury car woke up, logging the ignition sequence. CCTV cameras mounted on a neighbor's property captured the low-slung vehicle reversing out of the driveway. It didn't hesitate. It rolled down the quiet street, its tires gripping the freezing asphalt, and turned toward the main arterial roads. Inside the cabin, the husband was behind the wheel, and according to the telecommunications data, he was not alone. The cell towers tracking his phone were simultaneously tracking his wife's device. Both signals moved in perfect synchronized tandem, pinging off the same relays, traveling at the exact same speed. The woman who had allegedly walked away on foot was currently moving at 60 miles per hour inside the trunk of her own car. The Mercedes merged onto the Calder freeway. The route headed northwest, moving steadily away from the dense suburban grid of Melbourne and into the sprawling, desolate expanses of the Victorian countryside. The environment outside the tinted windows transitioned rapidly from manicured lawns to rough scrubland and towering, skeletal eucalyptus trees. The driving was deliberate and methodical. He maintained a steady speed, avoiding erratic lane changes, blending the expensive sports car into the heavy mid-morning commercial traffic. The cell towers tracked the dual signal up the highway, mapping a straight, unyielding line toward the Macedon Ranges. It was a 40-mile journey into absolute isolation. Mount Macedon is a rugged, heavily forested peak, characterized by dense undergrowth, steep ravines, and freezing temperatures that preserve the damp earth year-round. It is a place where light struggles to penetrate the canopy, and where the smell of rotting wood and wet clay dominates the air. At precisely 11:38 a.m., the dual digital footprint terminated. Both the husband's and the wife's phones disconnected from the network near the Gisborne cell tower at the very foothills of the mountain range. He had switched them off, or the sheer topography of the terrain had finally swallowed the signal. For the next 2 hours, the black Mercedes existed in a total surveillance vacuum. There were no cameras in the deep bushland. There were no digital handshakes. There was only the biting wind, the muddy access roads, and whatever grueling physical labor was required in the shadow of the mountain. The silence broke shortly after 1 p.m. The husband's phone reconnected to the grid, pinging a tower on the return route back toward the city. The wife's phone never powered back on. It remained dead, its final digital breath recorded permanently at the edge of the forest. Traffic cameras caught the SLK coupe merging back onto the freeway, heading south. The vehicle looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours prior, but the payload had changed. The trunk was empty. The rear suspension rode a fraction of an inch higher. He drove the car back to Avondale Heights, pulling into the driveway and cutting the engine. He walked back into the silent, pristine house. He placed the keys on the counter. He smoothed his clothing, washed his hands, and began to rehearse the lie he would tell his daughter when she came home from her shift. The story about the walk. The story about the faulty fuel gauge. The story about a woman who simply needed to clear her head. He sat in the empty living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture his wife had paid for, and waited for the panic to begin. Sarah returned to Avondale Heights just as the afternoon light faded into a biting gray dusk. The house was uncharacteristically dark and completely silent. Her mother's designer handbag sat on the polished granite island. The leather wallet and heavy keyring remained perfectly placed beside it. The patriarch fed his daughter the carefully constructed narrative, a heated disagreement over the accounting, a sudden need for fresh air, an unceremonious exit through the heavy front door. Sarah immediately sensed a visceral wrongness. The woman who built a retail empire through sheer force of will did not abandon her post, and she certainly did not leave her lifeline, her cell phone, sitting on a kitchen counter. The police were summoned. A standard missing persons report was filed. The husband played his role with terrifying ease. He presented himself as the frustrated but calm spouse, casually offering his story about the faulty fuel gauge and his solo test drive on the Calder freeway to explain his afternoon absence. Within 48 hours, the pristine, insulated illusion of the family collapsed entirely. The quiet suburban street transformed into a chaotic staging ground. Media vans, towering satellite dishes, and uniform patrols choked the manicured cul-de-sacs. The local atmosphere shifted from mild neighborly concern to a suffocating, paranoid dread. The boutique owner was a glamorous, highly visible fixture of their community. Women like her did not simply evaporate into the ether. The community mobilized with desperate, frantic energy. Grassroots search parties were organized. Thousands of flyers were printed, taping a smiling face to every storefront window, telephone pole, and transit station within a 20-mile radius. Yet the husband remained secured inside his sprawling home, insulated from the reality consuming the streets outside. He did not pass out flyers. He did not knock on doors. His physical absence from the desperate suburban search efforts became a dark, quiet rumor that spread rapidly through the affluent neighborhood. He watched the search from behind expensive window blinds. The defining psychological image of the early investigation was broadcast to the nation a few weeks later. Authorities arranged a formal press conference to appeal to the public for dashcam footage or witness accounts. Sarah stepped to the podium, physically trembling. Her voice fractured as she begged for anyone with information to come forward, pleading for her mother to just walk back through the front door. It was a raw, agonizing display of a young woman violently torn from her anchor. Standing directly behind her was her father. He was an immovable statue. His expression was locked in a rigid, unyielding mask of total apathy. He offered no tears. He provided no words of comfort. He did not place a reassuring hand on his collapsing daughter's shoulder. He simply stared past the camera lenses with cold, vacant eyes. The optics were devastating. Law enforcement experts and the viewing public simultaneously arrived at the exact same quiet, horrifying conclusion. That was not the face of a grieving, desperate husband in shock. It was the face of a man actively managing his own survival, entirely consumed by the effort of maintaining his internal lies. Weeks bled into months. The search grid expanded aggressively. Professional search and rescue teams scoured hundreds of square miles of dense brush. Dive teams plunged into near-freezing local reservoirs, sweeping the murky bottoms with sonar arrays. Dirt bikes and horseback patrols carved through the unforgiving scrubland bordering the highway, checking deep ravines, culverts, and abandoned mine shafts. Authorities pleaded for any footage of a black luxury coupe traveling northwest, but the landscape refused to yield its secret. The sheer scale of the Victorian bushland offered 1 million dark crevices to hide a body. The investigation ground to an agonizing, frustrating halt. The digital footprint had given detectives a general direction, but without physical evidence, without a crime scene, they were legally paralyzed. The husband continued to live in the large house, breathing the air of a free man. The paralysis finally broke 8 months later, February 20th, 2017. A seasoned hiker was navigating the steep, heavily timbered terrain of Mount Macedon Regional Park. He was miles off the main access paths, pushing through thick undergrowth, sharp brambles, and decaying eucalyptus logs. The environment was hostile and deeply isolated. The air in the dense forest was typically damp and earthy, but the wind shifted, carrying a distinctly different, heavy odor, the unmistakable, sweet sixth scent of advanced decomposition. The hiker followed the smell to a shallow natural depression situated between two massive fallen tree trunks. Wedged tightly beneath the rotting wood, deliberately concealed by layers of broken branches and 8 months of wet leaf litter, were skeletal remains. Crime scene technicians swarmed the isolated peak, setting up a perimeter in the freezing mud. The environment had been brutally unforgiving, accelerating the decay, but forensic analysis and dental records provided the final, grim confirmation a few days later. The remains belonged to the missing businesswoman. The facade of a voluntary disappearance was dead. The case instantly transitioned from a missing persons inquiry into a full-scale homicide investigation, and the quiet man in the Avondale Heights mansion was now squarely in the crosshairs. The identification of the remains fundamentally altered the atmosphere in Avondale Heights. The massive multi-level house was no longer a place of mourning. It was the epicenter of a homicide hunt. Detectives aggressively pivoted their tactics, but the mountain had been brutally efficient. 8 months exposed to the elements, local scavengers and the freezing damp earth had stripped away a forensic gold mine. There was no soft tissue left to determine the exact mechanics of the death. The skull was uncompromised. The hyoid bone was completely intact. The physical evidence of the violence remained locked away, forcing investigators to construct an airtight circumstantial net. They had their target. They simply needed to break his psychological armor. Before they could strike, the investigation was violently derailed from within the family tree. The stepson, long exiled due to his severe chemical dependencies, stepped directly into the blinding glare of the media. He became a chaotic, deeply erratic variable. He contacted news outlets, spinning dark, fragmented narratives that immediately flooded the public consciousness. He told journalists he had engaged in a vicious, screaming match with his stepmother days before she vanished, heavily implying his own guilt. Hours later, he would wildly pivot, loudly accusing his father of hiring underworld hitmen to erase mounting financial debts. The rumors infected the community like a virus. Neighbors began whispering about drug cartels, targeted hits, and hidden ledgers. This was a catastrophic distraction for law enforcement. Standard protocol dictated that every alternate theory, no matter how unhinged, had to be aggressively vetted. Detectives were forced to halt their forward momentum. They spent grueling, frustrating weeks auditing the addict's known associates, pulling thousands of his phone records and interviewing violent criminals. It was a massive, maddening sinkhole of resources. Every hour spent unraveling the younger man's fabricated underworld connections was an hour the true architect used to fortify his defenses. Eventually, the forensic timeline cleared the stepson entirely. His alibi was airtight. He was nothing more than a loud, destructive red herring, a ghost that had effectively stalled the pursuit of justice. With the noise finally cleared, the crosshairs snapped back to the patriarch. Investigators quietly impounded the black luxury coupe. It was transported to a sterile, brightly lit forensic bay, where technicians elevated the vehicle on a hydraulic lift to begin a molecular deconstruction of the undercarriage. Hidden deep inside the rear wheel wells, packed tightly behind the plastic splash guards, they found it. Trace amounts of gritty red clay mixed with degraded organic matter. Botanists analyzed the microscopic debris, concluding that the mineral composition, paired with specific pine needles and endemic flora, was an exact ecological match to the soil profile of Mount Macedon. The sports car had not been gliding down a paved freeway to test a faulty gauge. Its tires had been grinding through the wet, heavy earth of the deep bushland. Concurrently, cybercrime analysts finalized their telecommunications map. They moved beyond raw tower data, building a devastating visual graphic that overlaid the coupe's automated telemetry, engine ignition, speed, braking patterns, with the dual cellular signals. The data proved the victim's phone was securely inside the vehicle, moving at highway speeds, locked in perfect synchronization with the suspect's device. They traced the digital breadcrumbs right to the edge of the forest canopy before both signals were deliberately severed. Physical property searches yielded another glaring anomaly. Warrants were executed at the sprawling suburban home, where detectives cataloged every tool in the pristine garage and backyard shed. They cross-referenced the inventory with historical credit card purchases. A heavy-duty flat-edged shovel was completely unaccounted for. It was a specific brand and model he had recently acquired, one that perfectly matched the dimensions and the sharp cut marks found deep in the dense clay of the shallow grave. The earth had been moved by that exact tool, and the tool had vanished. Armed with the botanical trace, the digital synchronicity, and the missing equipment, detectives finally brought the husband into a windowless interrogation room. This was the psychological climax. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical note as investigators slid glossy photographs across the metal table. The CCTV stills of the car, the mapped-out cell towers, the soil samples. They watched his face, waiting for a micro-expression of panic, waiting for the sudden realization that the walls had closed in. He offered them absolutely nothing. He did not crack, weep, or attempt to weave a new lie. Instead, he deployed a chillingly disciplined defense mechanism, retreating into an impenetrable fortress of silence. Over the course of a grueling, multi-hour interview, veteran investigators fired hundreds of pointed, devastating questions. They asked him how heavy his wife felt when he lifted her out of the trunk. They asked him what the freezing dirt felt like on his bare hands. They asked him where the shovel was hidden. To every single inquiry, he responded with a flat, robotic refusal, invoking his legal right to remain completely silent. The repetitive, monotonous denials echoed off the cinderblock walls, an agonizing display of absolute sociopathic control. Detectives released him, but the trap was already set. Covert listening devices were planted inside his home and vehicle. Police monitored thousands of hours of ambient noise, waiting for the psychological weight of the murder to crush him into a whispered confession to his daughter, or a muttered apology in an empty room. But his discipline was terrifying. He lived for months knowing he was hunted, yet he never slipped, maintaining the flawless facade of a grieving father. Finally, in late 2017, the authorities decided the circumstantial web was heavy enough to hold. Heavily armed tactical units intercepted his vehicle on a busy thoroughfare. They dragged him from the driver's seat, snapping thick steel cuffs onto his wrists. The architect of the silence was formally charged with murder. The legal reckoning arrived in March 2019. The Supreme Court was primed for a brutal, protracted murder trial. Prosecutors had meticulously stacked the circumstantial evidence, the synchronized digital footprints, the botanical trace from the mountain, the missing shovel, but the defense understood the fatal flaw in the state's armory. Without soft tissue, medical examiners could not definitively prove lethal intent. On the very eve of the trial, the patriarch executed his final cynical pivot. He entered a sudden plea of guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. It was a masterstroke of legal survival. By admitting to an unintentional killing, he circumvented the murder trial entirely. Most importantly, the plea deal allowed him to maintain his absolute, unyielding silence. He would never be legally forced to explain how his wife died, nor describe the exact mechanics of her final moments. The initial sentencing triggered profound public outrage. The presiding judge handed down a highly controversial 9-year term, requiring a minimum of just 6 years served before parole eligibility. Prosecutors immediately filed an aggressive appeal against the leniency, arguing the sentence failed to reflect the calculated post-offense concealment. Later that year, the appellate court delivered a heavier mandate, 13 years behind bars, with a non-parole period of 10. It was a structural victory for the state, but a profoundly hollow one. Mount Macedon remains indifferent to the tragedy once buried in its soil. The freezing winds still sweep through the dense eucalyptus canopy, slowly erasing the physical scars of that winter. But the psychological wreckage is permanent. A daughter is left navigating a shattered reality, where her ultimate protector was also the architect of her deepest trauma. Borce sits in a concrete cell, maintaining his flawless, sociopathic discipline. The absolute truth of those final, violent minutes belongs only to him, a dark, heavy secret he intends to carry straight into the earth. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. A multi-millionaire heir to a private aviation empire. A man with access to sprawling properties, helicopters, and limitless cash. Yet, in the dead of night, he fired up a $25,000 industrial incinerator to erase a hard-working family man from existence. His motive wasn't a bitter corporate rivalry or a high-stakes ransom. He destroyed a life and shattered a family, all to steal a used Dodge pickup truck, a vehicle he could have easily bought with pocket change. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. The Millard family name was practically royalty in the private aviation sector. The dynasty began decades earlier, built from the ground up by a patriarchal figure who launched Millard Air, a massive charter airline that eventually transitioned into a highly lucrative aircraft maintenance business. Born into this sprawling empire, the young heir inherited a life most people cannot even fathom. He grew up on massive estates, surrounded by luxury vehicles, private runways, and a seemingly endless flow of capital. By his early teens, he was setting aviation records, flying solo helicopters long before he could legally drive a car. When his father passed away, the keys to the entire kingdom fell into his hands. He took ownership of a colossal 50,000 square foot aviation hangar located at a regional airport, a massive steel fortress that he treated as his personal playground. Inside that hangar, the sheer scale of wealth was staggering. The polished concrete floors housed fleets of vintage cars, expensive off-road vehicles, and custom-built commercial trailers. The heir didn't just have money, he had absolute, unchecked freedom. There were no financial limitations, no authorities to answer to, and no consequences for his actions. He could travel anywhere on a whim, throwing lavish parties that lasted for days, funding the lifestyles of his sycophantic friends who fed his ego. But endless privilege breeds a very specific type of darkness. When you can afford anything the world has to offer, the material value of objects begins to evaporate. Buying a high-end sports car or a heavy-duty truck offered no thrill. The transaction was too easy. The only way to feel anything, the only way to cure the suffocating boredom of absolute wealth, was to take things that belonged to others. It was a psychological mutation. His entitlement morphed into a god complex. He began stealing heavy machinery, construction equipment, and vehicles. Not for profit, but for the sheer adrenaline rush. It was a terrifying game. He needed to prove that the rules governing ordinary society simply did not apply to him. He viewed the world as a personal hunting ground, and other people as mere pawns existing for his amusement. Miles away from the sprawling private hangars and multi-million-dollar trusts lived a man who represented the exact opposite of that unearned privilege. He was a 32-year-old devoted husband and a father to a young daughter. He built his life on early mornings, hard physical labor, and the quiet satisfaction of providing for his family. Every dollar he earned was accounted for, channeled into mortgages, groceries, and the future of his child. He drove a heavy-duty 2007 Dodge Ram 3500. The truck was a workhorse, a symbol of his blue-collar reality, carrying tools and memories alike. But as expenses mounted and priorities shifted toward his family's needs, he made a practical decision. He needed to sell the pickup to clear some debt and find a more suitable family vehicle. He detailed the interior, took a few photos in his driveway, and posted a listing on a popular online classified site. It was a routine transaction, the kind of mundane digital handshake that happens thousands of times a day across the country. Someone posts an ad, a buyer calls, they agree on a price, and they shake hands. The seller expected nothing more than a simple cash exchange to help his family move forward. Instead, his digital listing caught the eye of a predator. Sitting inside his fortress of steel and concrete, the aviation heir scrolled through the classifieds. He didn't want to buy the truck. He wanted the high of taking it. The God complex demanded a new thrill, and the target had just been locked. The aviation heir did not operate in a vacuum. Every predator needs a shadow, someone to validate their delusions of grandeur. He found his in a 25-year-old aspiring rapper with a minor criminal record and a life strictly confined to his mother's basement. The power dynamic between the two men was absolute and entirely lopsided. The heir provided the funding, the luxury vehicles, and the intoxicating illusion of a high-stakes lifestyle. In return, the younger man offered blind, unwavering loyalty. He was less of a partner and more of a trained attack dog, eager to impress a master who viewed the world as his personal property. Together, they formed a toxic, escalating feedback loop. What began as petty theft and suburban vandalism mutated over months into an appetite for severe, calculated violence. The aviation business was quietly hemorrhaging cash, but the heir's lavish expenditures had not slowed. He had recently developed an obsession with off-road desert racing, purchasing custom Baja vehicles that required massive, reinforced trailers for transport. To haul this heavy equipment across thousands of miles, he needed a very specific workhorse, a 3/4-ton diesel pickup. His bank accounts held millions. He could have walked into any dealership in the country and paid cash for a brand new fleet, but convenience offered no dopamine rush. Purchasing the truck removed the thrill of the hunt. He didn't just want the vehicle. He wanted the raw power of taking it from someone else. The planning phase was methodical, driven by the heir's arrogant belief that he possessed a criminal genius the authorities could never unravel. In early May, he stepped into a dimly lit convenience store and purchased a cheap prepaid cell phone, paying in untraceable cash. He activated the device under a fictitious name, securing a burner line that he believed effectively severed his digital footprint. Armed with this ghost phone, the two men retreated to the cavernous, echoing expanse of the aviation hangar. Surrounded by the faint smell of engine grease and jet fuel, illuminated only by the cold blue light of a laptop screen, they began scrolling through online automotive classifieds. It was a surreal, modern form of stalking. Everyday citizens post photos of their driveways, their manicured lawns, the interiors of their vehicles, unwittingly inviting predators into their lives. The heir analyzed these digital listings with clinical detachment, filtering out commercial dealerships to focus exclusively on private, individual sellers. Their initial hunting expedition occurred a day before the fatal encounter, and it nearly ended their game before it began. They zeroed in on a seller in a neighboring city who had listed an identical truck. The predators arranged an evening test drive, dropped off near the target's home by a third accomplice in a large SUV. But the situation immediately deteriorated. The seller was a towering, heavily muscled former military man who instantly sensed an unsettling shift in the atmosphere when the two strangers approached. They were too quiet, their body language entirely disjointed from the usual enthusiasm of a car buyer. During the brief test drive, the seller refused to yield control. He squeezed his large frame into the back seat, physically dominating the cramped space of the cab, and shut down their probing, awkward questions with short, defensive answers. The air inside the truck grew heavy with unspoken tension. The heir, sensing the tactical disadvantage, abandoned the plan. They cut the drive short, vanished down a dark street, and left the man alive, completely unaware of the abyss he had just stepped back from. But the God complex demanded satisfaction. The failure only sharpened the heir's predatory focus. The following evening, the glow of the laptop screen illuminated a new listing. It was a pristine black 2007 model located in a quiet, rural suburban community roughly 40 miles away. The photos showed a peaceful residential street, large lots, and a distinct lack of heavy security. It was the perfect stage. Using the burner phone, the heir left a casual voice message. When the callback came, he utilized a practiced, disarming tone. He asked standard, mundane questions about the engine's mileage, the condition of the tires, the vehicle's maximum towing capacity. He was polite, articulate, and completely devoid of menace. They agreed to meet for a test drive that same evening, just as the sun was scheduled to dip below the horizon. The preparation for the meeting was swift and chillingly pragmatic. The heir and his shadow stripped away their expensive watches and designer clothing, dressing down in dark, nondescript hoodies to blend into the suburban landscape. Before leaving the hangar, the heir packed a small, unassuming satchel. Inside, heavy and cold, was a compact handgun. This was never intended to be a simple vehicle theft. The weapon was not packed for intimidation, nor was it a contingency plan for a robbery gone wrong. The heir had already made his decision. The truck was coming back to the hangar tonight, and whoever held the keys was simply an acceptable casualty in his twisted pursuit of ultimate control. Monday, May 6th. The air carried that distinct evening chill, typical of early spring, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long, fading shadows across the manicured lawns. Inside the sprawling rural property, dinner had just wrapped up. The seller, a man deeply rooted in his community, known for his relentless work ethic and easy smile, was finalizing the details of the impending transaction. He stood in the kitchen, chatting with his wife, while glancing out the window toward the heavy-duty Dodge Ram parked in the driveway. The truck was spotless, freshly washed and detailed for the new owners. The plan was entirely routine. The buyers would arrive, inspect the engine, take a quick drive down the local rural routes, hand over the cash, and be on their way. The funds would clear a path for a newer, more family-friendly vehicle. It was a mundane chore on a standard weekday. At roughly 9:20, the sweeping headlights of a large SUV cut across the dark asphalt at the edge of the property. The vehicle didn't pull into the driveway. Instead, it idled near the property line, dropping off two figures before silently accelerating away into the night. Footsteps crunched heavily on the loose gravel. The seller stepped out of the warm glow of his front porch to greet them, while his wife stood just inside the doorway, observing the interaction through the glass. The physical contrast between the two strangers was stark and immediately unsettling. The primary speaker was tall, lanky, projecting a practiced, almost overly polite demeanor. His companion was significantly shorter, hunched, his face obscured by a dark hood, shifting his weight nervously in the shadows. He looked completely out of place in the quiet, upscale neighborhood. The wife felt a sharp, sudden knot of apprehension form in her stomach. Something about the duo felt deeply asymmetrical, a discordant note in an otherwise ordinary evening. The tall man took the lead, asking standard automotive questions and requesting to see under the hood. The seller obliged, reaching into the cab to pop the latch. The heavy metallic clunk of the hood opening echoed in the quiet night air. For a few minutes, the three men leaned over the engine block, the glow of a small flashlight illuminating the mechanics. The buyer nodded, expressing satisfaction, and suggested they take the truck out to test the transmission. The seller agreed, as it was standard protocol to accompany a stranger, ensuring the vehicle wasn't simply driven off the lot and stolen. He turned back toward the house, catching his wife's eye one last time. He offered a quick, reassuring wave, indicating he would be right back. The tall stranger climbed into the driver's seat. The seller took the passenger side. The hooded figure slipped into the cramped space of the rear cab, directly behind the owner. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a deep, vibrating rumble that rattled the windows of the house. The brake lights flared red in the darkness. The gears shifted, and the truck rolled slowly down the driveway, merging onto the rural highway. The wife watched the red taillights shrink into the distance until they were swallowed completely by the blackness of the road. Inside the cab, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The polite facade evaporated. The road ahead was unlit, empty, surrounded by dense farmland. The interior of the truck was bathed in the harsh green glow of the dashboard instrument panel. The heater blew dry air. The rhythmic hum of the heavy tires on the pavement provided the only sound. The conversation died. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. The driver stared straight ahead, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The seller turned his head, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, the palpable shift in the space. He looked toward the driver, then toward the rearview mirror. The man in the back seat was no longer slouching. He was sitting up. The movement was sharp, deliberate. The seller realized the terrifying reality of his situation. He was trapped inside a moving metal box, hurtling down a deserted two-lane highway at 60 miles per hour. There was nowhere to run, no handle to pull. The driver reached into the small satchel resting on his lap. The movement was practiced, fluid. He pulled the compact handgun. The metallic click of the slide echoed over the diesel engine. The seller barely had time to process the steel barrel leveling in his direction. There was no negotiation, no demand for the keys, no warning. The predator did not want to steal the truck and leave a witness. He wanted the absolute power of the kill. A single shot shattered the enclosed space, deafening, final. The heavy caliber round found its mark instantly. The violent, concussive force filled the cab with the sharp, acidic smell of burnt gunpowder and the heavy, metallic stench of fresh blood. The seller slumped forward. The struggle was over before it began. A life extinguished in a fraction of a second, all for a piece of machinery. The driver didn't panic. He didn't swerve. His heart rate barely spiked. He simply kept his foot on the accelerator, guiding the 3-ton vehicle smoothly through the darkness. The lifeless body of the owner bleeding out into the passenger seat upholstery. The God complex was fully fed. He had successfully taken a life, proving to himself that he existed entirely outside the boundaries of human morality. The hooded accomplice in the back seat remained silent, entirely subservient to the violence he had just witnessed. They needed to secure the prize. The stolen truck, now a rolling crime scene, was navigated through a labyrinth of back roads, heading straight toward the sprawling aviation hangar. Within an hour, the heavy rolling doors of the private aerospace facility ground open. The truck was driven deep into the cavernous concrete belly of the building. The doors slid shut, sealing them off from the outside world. The fluorescent industrial lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile blue-white glare over the blood-soaked interior of the cab. The heir stepped out of the vehicle, his dark clothing stained, his demeanor utterly detached. He was no longer a murderer. He was a project manager handling a logistical inconvenience. He ordered his shadow to begin the cleanup. The interior of the Dodge required total sterilization. They began ripping out the seats, tearing up the saturated carpeting, and dismantling the dashboard components that had been compromised by the violent discharge. But the most pressing issue was the physical evidence of the victim. The heir walked to the far corner of his industrial fortress. Sitting on a massive steel trailer was his recent, highly specialized purchase. It was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade animal incinerator, internally branded as the Eliminator. It was a towering piece of machinery designed to vaporize massive agricultural carcasses at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The heir had purchased it weeks prior, using his vast financial resources to bypass the usual agricultural licensing questions. He connected the heavy propane lines, the steel doors were unlatched, the industrial burners ignited with a deep, echoing roar, the extreme heat instantly warping the air around the machine. The victim was stripped of his humanity, reduced to mere biological waste in the eyes of his killer, and loaded into the firing chamber. The heavy doors slammed shut, the temperature gauges spiked. Inside the steel belly of the machine, all physical evidence of the hard-working father, the devoted husband, was methodically and utterly destroyed. Outside the hangar, the night remained quiet. The stars shone indifferently over the massive estate. The heir had played his deadly game, won his prize, and erased his tracks. He believed he was entirely untouchable. The wife stood by the front window, her forehead resting against the cold glass. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The rural road remained empty. No headlights swept across the manicured lawn. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed in the quiet hallway. She stepped back into the kitchen, picking up her mobile phone. She dialed his number. It rang out and automatically switched to a generic voicemail greeting. She dropped the call and tried again. Same result. The knot in her stomach tightened into a dense, freezing dread. Her husband was a creature of strict routine. He was tethered to his family. He would never ignore her calls, and he would absolutely never vanish without a word. An hour crawled by, stretching into an eternity. The silence in the house grew suffocating. The digital display on the stove clicked to midnight. The driveway remained an empty void. She paced the living room floor, endlessly replaying the mental footage of the two strangers. The tall, overly polite one who did all the talking. The hunched, quiet one shifting nervously in the dark hoodie. They were a bizarre mismatch, a jagged, wrong piece in an otherwise normal puzzle. Her fingers trembled violently as she dialed the local police precinct, her voice breaking as she explained that the test drive was supposed to last 10 minutes, and it had been hours. Law enforcement agencies are traditionally slow to react when an adult male is reported missing. Standard protocol typically assumes a voluntary departure, a sudden breakdown in communication, a late night that spiraled out of control. But the narrative provided by the frantic wife shattered every standard mold. Her husband had departed with two complete strangers in a 3-ton vehicle into the pitch black of a rural highway. He left his wallet resting on the kitchen counter. He left his daily medication sitting in the cabinet. He took nothing but the keys. The officers arrived at the residence shortly after 2 in the morning, their boots crunching on the gravel. They stood in the driveway, shining high-powered tactical flashlights over the empty asphalt where the heavy-duty pickup had been parked just hours prior. The initial assessment was grim, yet still hopeful. Vehicles stolen during test drives were not an uncommon occurrence. But in almost every historical instance, the rightful owners were shoved out of the cab a few blocks away. They walked to a gas station, they flagged down a passing car. They did not simply dissolve into the night air. The police immediately began knocking on neighboring doors, waking up the suburban street, searching for anyone who might have seen which direction the black truck turned. They simultaneously pinged the missing man's cell phone, but the signal was completely dead. The device had been powered off or destroyed shortly after the vehicle left the driveway. Investigators then pulled the call logs from the residence, isolating the number of the prospective buyer who had arranged the meeting. They ran the digits through the telecom databases, hoping for a quick address match. Instead, they hit a solid brick wall. The number belonged to a cheap, prepaid burner phone. It was registered to a fictitious name, purchased with untraceable cash. The realization hit the detectives hard. This was not a spur-of-the-moment joyride or a robbery of opportunity. This was a highly calculated, premeditated trap. The strangers had meticulously planned their approach, leaving absolutely no digital breadcrumbs behind. By dawn, the quiet neighborhood was transformed into an active command post, lined with flashing patrol cruisers and news vans. The sun rose over a community that was about to be thrust into a state of collective, sheer panic. The story broke on local morning broadcasts first. then spread like a digital wildfire across the province and the continent. A photograph of the smiling, hardworking father, paired with the license plate and description of the 2007 Dodge Ram, flooded social media feeds and television screens. The social echo was immediate, visceral, and profound. It struck a primal nerve within the public consciousness. This was not a high-risk individual caught in a dangerous underworld lifestyle. This was a suburban homeowner trying to sell a used truck online to clear some debt. It was a mundane transaction that millions of citizens executed every single day without a second thought. The terrifying realization settled heavily over the region. If a man could be swallowed by the dark right from his own front yard, the illusion of safety was entirely shattered. Friends, extended family, and hundreds of complete strangers mobilized with staggering, military-like precision. Command centers were hastily established in local church basements and rented community halls. Volunteers printed tens of thousands of flyers, taping them to telephone poles, highway rest stops, and grocery store bulletin boards across a radius stretching hundreds of miles. Organized search parties formed, walking shoulder to shoulder through dense, muddy wooded areas and overgrown ravines. They dragged heavy branches aside, battling through thick underbrush and unpredictable spring weather, scanning the steep ditches along the rural routes for any glint of chrome, shattered glass, or disturbed earth. The physical toll on the volunteers was immense, their boots sinking into wet clay as they combed through thousands of acres of unforgiving terrain. Yet, the numbers of searchers only multiplied as the hours ticked by. The atmosphere was thick with adrenaline and a desperate, clawing hope. Tips began pouring into the dedicated police hotlines by the minute. Sightings of black pickups were reported from distant border crossings to remote logging roads. Every single lead was chased down by exhausted detectives, and every single lead dissolved into a frustrating dead end. Back at the residence, the psychological toll was unbearable. The wife sat squarely in the epicenter of a media hurricane. Surrounded by flashing cameras and thrust microphones, she pleaded for the safe return of the man she loved. She spoke directly into the lenses, her voice trembling but resolute, addressing the unseen captors. She explained that he was a provider, that his young daughter was waiting by the door for him to come home. Her heartbreak was broadcast everywhere, gripping the public in a horrifying state of suspense. Where was the truck? Who were the two strangers? How could a massive piece of machinery evade every highway camera and patrol unit? Days turned into an agonizing, surreal blur of press conferences, shifting police updates, and relentless ground searches. The initial surge of adrenaline within the community slowly mutated into a cold, creeping paranoia. People began locking their deadbolts before the sun went down. Online sellers rapidly pulled their classified ads off the internet, suddenly terrified of the anonymous faces that might show up at their property. The invisible predator had cast a long, suffocating shadow over the entire region, while the missing man remained a ghost. The first 48 hours of a missing persons case dictate the trajectory of the entire investigation. Homicide detectives took command of the precinct, setting up massive tactical whiteboards that remained agonizingly blank. The prepaid cell phone was their only tangible thread. Cybercrimes units pulled the regional cellular tower data, tracking the device's incredibly brief lifespan. The electronic trail showed the phone powering on near a suburban strip mall, moving steadily toward the victim's rural neighborhood, and shutting down completely just moments after the test drive began. It was a digital ghost. The perpetrators had actively avoided toll highways, keeping the stolen heavy-duty pickup off the main grid and entirely out of view of automated traffic cameras. Detectives were operating in a total blackout. The frustration inside the command center was palpable, heavy with the terrifying knowledge that a citizen had been erased without leaving a single physical trace on the asphalt. Investigators were forced to pivot their strategy. If the perpetrators used the popular classified site to target this specific truck, they had likely cast a wider net beforehand. Cyber analysts requested the server logs from the website's hosting company, cross-referencing IP addresses and search queries for identical diesel models in the region. They compiled a sprawling list of recent sellers and began knocking on doors. It was tedious, exhausting shoe leather police work. Most interviews yielded absolutely nothing. Detectives spoke with regular citizens who had successfully sold their vehicles or simply taken their listings down after losing interest. Then, they found the imposing former military man who had aggressively hijacked his own test drive a day prior to the disappearance. Seated across from investigators in a cramped interview room, he calmly recounted the bizarre encounter. He detailed the mismatched duo, the tall, overly polite speaker, and the silent, hooded shadow. He explained how the air in his cab had felt entirely wrong, a primal warning that prompted him to shut down the drive and return home. But it was a passing observation that ultimately broke the case wide open. The veteran noted that while the tall man gripped the steering wheel, his dark sleeve had ridden up, revealing a distinct black ink tattoo on his lower wrist. The word was ambition. A physical identifier changed the entire landscape of the hunt. Intelligence analysts fed the height, build, and the specific wrist tattoo into regional databases, expecting to generate a hit for a low-level car theft ring or a known chop shop operator. Instead, the algorithm produced a profile that brought the entire command center to a dead halt. The face on the screen belonged to a multimillionaire private aviation heir, a man with zero financial motive to steal a used vehicle. Detectives stared at the dossier in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the immense wealth, the helicopters, the sprawling properties, the corporate trusts, with a violent suburban hijacking. It defied every fundamental rule of criminal profiling, but the digital evidence began to align with terrifying precision. Warrants were expedited for the heir's personal cell phone records, bypassing the dead burner device entirely. The geolocation data placed his primary phone on the exact same rural highway at the exact time the victim vanished. The illusion of the untouchable criminal mastermind fractured instantly under the weight of basic forensic tracking. The tactical response was massive and immediate. Heavily armed police units mobilized, rolling out in a synchronized convoy toward the heir's sprawling rural properties and the regional airport. The sheer scale of the suspect's assets complicated the raid. Officers had to secure multiple locations simultaneously, navigating acres of private farmland and massive commercial structures. The heir was intercepted while driving one of his luxury SUVs, pulled over by unmarked tactical units on a public road. He was ordered out of the vehicle at gunpoint. He complied with smooth, eerie calm, his face entirely devoid of surprise or panic. He believed his immense wealth and his meticulous cleanup had insulated him from any real consequences. He assumed the police had nothing but circumstantial theories. He was wrong. The primary tactical team breached the heavy steel doors of the 50,000 square foot aviation hangar. Officers flooded the dimly lit, cavernous space, their weapon-mounted lights sweeping over vintage cars, aircraft parts, and custom commercial trailers. Tucked deep in the back, partially obscured by heavy equipment, sat a large enclosed cargo hauler. Detectives broke the heavy padlocks and threw open the rear doors. Inside sat the stolen 2007 Dodge Ram. The exterior was intact, but the interior had been violently stripped. The seats were torn out. The carpeting was ripped away to the bare metal floorboards. Gunpowder residue and microscopic blood spatter coated the remaining dashboard panels. The truck was a rolling tomb. The discovery of the vehicle secured the theft and assault charges, but a man was still missing. Forensic teams expanded their grid, moving outside the steel fortress to catalog the surrounding agricultural property. Hidden in plain sight, sitting quietly in a patch of tall grass near the tree line, was the towering industrial animal incinerator. The exterior steel was coated in a fine layer of fresh soot. Detectives approached the machine cautiously, the air around it still carrying a faint, heavy chemical odor. Crime scene technicians unlatched the heavy access doors and peered into the firing chamber. The visual confirmation hit the veteran officers like a physical blow. The extreme heat of the propane burners had destroyed almost everything, but the process was imperfect. Sifting through the heavy gray ash, technicians uncovered fragments of bone that had survived the 1500-degree inferno. It was the absolute horrific realization of the victim's fate. He had not been dumped in a river. He had not been buried in a shallow grave. He had been vaporized in a piece of machinery by a man who simply wanted to see if he could get away with murder. The psychological profile of the predator was now entirely clear to the investigators. This was a thrill kill orchestrated by a sociopath completely insulated by extreme wealth. Within hours of the hangar raid, police tracked down the hooded shadow, the aspiring rapper hiding out in his mother's basement. Surrounded by tactical shields, he surrendered without a fight. The fragile alliance between the mastermind and his attack dog immediately fractured under the intense pressure of the interrogation rooms and looming homicide charges. The pieces of the dark puzzle were finally locked into place. The physical evidence was secured. The perpetrators were in handcuffs. The investigation transitioned from a frantic search and rescue into an ironclad preparation for legal warfare. The trial commenced in a suffocatingly tense courtroom. Stripped of his sprawling estates, the aviation heir sat at the defense table, his trademark arrogance slowly eroding. In a desperate final flex of his god complex, he fired his legal team and represented himself. He personally cross-examined witnesses, even the victim's grieving wife, attempting to weave convoluted alternate theories of a robbery gone wrong. The prosecution dismantled his delusions with undeniable science. They presented the violently stripped Dodge pickup, the exact digital footprint of the burner phone, and the microscopic fragments recovered from the industrial incinerator. The co-defendant took the stand, turning on his master in a frantic bid for leniency. He detailed the sudden gunshot inside the moving vehicle and the cold, mechanical cleanup at the hangar. The overwhelming forensic weight left no room for doubt. It took the jury just 5 days to return a verdict. Both men were found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the absolute maximum penalty: life in a maximum security penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The limitless wealth and private fleets could not buy a way out of an 8x10 concrete cell. The illusion of absolute entitlement ultimately collapsed under its own weight. A sprawling aviation dynasty, built over generations, was reduced to a footnote in criminal history, dismantled by the arrogance of an heir who believed the world was his to take. The wealth is gone. The hangars are empty. But the real tragedy remains anchored in a quiet suburban home, a permanent, devastating void where a husband and father used to be. A heavy price paid for a piece of machinery. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. On December 3rd, 2016, patrol officers found an abandoned 1992 Oldsmobile running on the shoulder of the Route 35 bridge in Belmar, New Jersey. The keys were still in the ignition. The owner, 19-year-old Sarah Stern, was gone. It looked like a textbook suicide, a tragic leap into the freezing currents of the Shark River, but the water below held no body. The real horror wasn't in the river. It was wearing the face of her childhood best friend, who had timed her execution on his phone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Neptune City sits on the New Jersey coastline, a working-class borough where the salt air strips the paint off coastal homes and the winters bite with a damp, freezing wind. It was here that Sarah Stern navigated the turbulent transition between adolescence and adulthood. She was an artist at her core, a young woman who viewed her surroundings almost entirely through the lens of a camera. She spent her days producing independent YouTube videos, sketching, and dreaming of a career in digital media. Her energy was magnetic, if somewhat erratic. She drove a fading 1992 Oldsmobile 88, preferred oversized hoodies, and possessed a deeply trusting nature that naturally drew marginalized kids into her orbit. But beneath that vibrant, creative exterior lay a profound and lingering grief. In 2013, her world fractured permanently. Her mother, Laura, lost a brutal, exhausting battle with melanoma. Sarah was only 16 when the foundation of her life collapsed. Her father, Michael, did everything he could to maintain a sense of stability and normalcy in their home, but the absence of a mother left Sarah searching for an emotional anchor. She clung heavily to her closest peers, elevating them from casual high school friends to a surrogate family. She desperately needed protectors and confidants, people who could ground her when the trauma of her mother's death felt too heavy to carry alone. 3 years later, another family death would inadvertently set a horrific chain of events into motion. By late 2016, Sarah's grandmother had passed away, leaving behind a vacant property in the nearby coastal town of Avon by the Sea. The residence was located just a few miles down the road, a quiet house filled with decades of accumulated belongings. Sarah was tasked with helping her father clear out the estate. It was a tedious, dusty process, sorting through heavy wooden dressers, forgotten financial documents, and rooms thick with the scent of mothballs and aging paper. During this excavation, she found a locked metal box shoved into the back of a closet. When she finally managed to pry the lid open, she didn't find old photographs or worthless costume jewelry. The box was packed tight with cash. These were not crisp, modern banknotes. It was a massive hoard of vintage currency, 50s and 100s dating back decades, their paper brittle and smelling strongly of mildew and old ink. The exact amount was difficult to verify immediately, but it was staggering. Sarah estimated the windfall to be anywhere from $10,000 to nearly $100,000. For a 19-year-old surviving on minimum wage shifts, this was not just a lucky find, it was a lifeline. The money represented absolute, immediate freedom. Sarah immediately began formulating an exit strategy. She researched packing up her Oldsmobile and crossing the border to Canada to start over, or perhaps driving 3,000 miles west to California to launch her own media production company. The brittle vintage bills were her ticket out of the grief-stricken corridors of her New Jersey life. Her fatal mistake was viewing the world through a lens of absolute trust. Sarah did not possess a secretive bone in her body. Overwhelmed by the adrenaline of the discovery, she did exactly what any excited teenager would do. She broadcasted her luck. She took a portion of the cash to her local bank, attempting to deposit the older bills, only to be informed by the teller that the severely dated currency could not be processed locally and required routing through the Federal Reserve. Frustrated but undeterred, she took the money back home, transferring the fortune into 2 separate shoeboxes, which she slid under her bed. She shared the secret of the shoeboxes with the 2 boys she trusted most in the world. She believed she was sharing a miracle with her brothers. She had no comprehension that she had just placed a bounty on her own head. Sarah did not just stumble into a friendship with Liam McAtasney and Preston Taylor. Their bond was forged during the vulnerable, formative years of early adolescence. They were a trio tightly knit by proximity and shared coastal routines. Liam was the gregarious one, a teenager who knew exactly how to command a room, masking any deeper insecurities with a loud, confident exterior. Preston was quieter, a follower by nature, someone who naturally gravitated toward Liam's relentless pull. Sarah viewed both of them not just as peers, but as fundamental pillars of her shrinking world. They navigated the awkward transitions of high school together, attending the same basement parties and driving aimlessly along the shoreline. Preston even accompanied Sarah to her junior prom, a gesture that cemented his role as a trusted confidant in the eyes of her father. When the sickness finally claimed her mother, it was Liam and Preston who formed the protective perimeter around her. They were the ones she cried to in the dark, the ones who provided a distraction when the silence in her house became utterly suffocating. In her mind, they were surrogate brothers. The idea that either of them could harbor malice toward her was fundamentally incomprehensible. But proximity to trauma can sometimes breed a twisted sense of entitlement. While she leaned on them for emotional survival, Liam began to view their dynamic through a highly transactional lens. He was notoriously focused on status and quick financial independence, often vocalizing his deep frustration over working menial, low-wage jobs. He wanted a shortcut. When Sarah pulled those shoeboxes out from under her bed and exposed the vintage currency, the foundational nature of their relationship simply evaporated. For the grieving daughter, sharing the secret was an act of profound vulnerability. For Liam, it was a financial audit. He did not see a fragile friend holding a delicate lifeline. He saw an unguarded vault. He later described his thought process in entirely clinical, detached terms. He noted the exact dimensions of the security lockbox she eventually purchased to house the cash. He calculated the weight of the steel. He estimated the total yield. The money became a psychological parasite that completely overwrote a decade of trust. He knew he could not execute an extraction of that magnitude alone. He needed logistical support, and he knew exactly who possessed the moral flexibility to assist him. Preston was currently sharing an apartment with Liam, their lives intertwined by a lease and a long-established hierarchy where Liam dictated every term. The conversations between the two roommates did not begin with murder. They started with hypothetical grievances about fairness. Liam planted seeds of resentment, suggesting that their friend was careless with her newfound wealth, that she did not appreciate the true value of what she had pulled from the dusty closet. He rationalized the theft by framing the cash as discarded, forgotten property that rightfully belonged to whoever possessed the ambition to take it. Preston absorbed this twisted logic without a single point of resistance. He was promised a cut of exactly $3,000. It was a pitifully low figure to place on a human life, but enough to secure his absolute complicity. The plan evolved organically in the dark confines of their shared apartment. What began as a burglary scheme morphed into something terminal. Liam reasoned that if they simply stole the lockbox, she would immediately point the authorities in their direction, given she had only shown the money to a handful of people. The only way to guarantee a clean getaway was to ensure the sole witness could never speak to a detective. The transition from theoretical plotting to active hunting was remarkably swift and deeply predatory. Liam began stalking his childhood protector, mapping out her daily routines. He noted when her father left for work, calculating the exact windows of total residential isolation. He even visited her house under the guise of casual hangouts, secretly analyzing the layout of the property, measuring the distance from the front door to the street, and testing the structural integrity of the lockbox. He was meticulously cold. He discussed the mechanics of strangulation with his roommate, researching precisely how long it would take a human brain to succumb to oxygen deprivation. He set a timer on his phone, visualizing the violent process. He needed to know exactly how many minutes he would have to endure the physical struggle before her heart stopped beating. They also plotted the disposal. The Route 35 bridge crossing the Shark River was selected for its impressive height and its freezing, rapid currents. A jump from that elevation would easily be classified as a tragic suicide, perfectly aligning with her known history of severe depression following her mother's death. Liam intended to weaponize her psychological trauma, using her deepest scars as the ultimate alibi. In the weeks leading up to the ambush, he maintained a flawless, terrifying facade. He texted her regularly, hung out in her living room, and offered emotional support, all while carrying the blueprint for her execution in his pocket. He was completely devoid of the typical anxieties that accompany premeditated crimes. There was no hesitation, no crisis of conscience. He viewed the impending violence as a necessary administrative step to access capital. He dictated to Preston precisely what his role would be. The subordinate was instructed to wait by a two-way radio, ready to extract the heavy lockbox and drive the getaway vehicles. The delegation of tasks was handled like a mundane shift schedule at a fast food restaurant. They were two teenagers dissecting a human life into logistical bullet points. Meanwhile, the target remained completely oblivious to the predator sitting on her couch. She continued to plan her cross-country escape, eagerly discussing her itinerary with the very person tasked with ensuring she never left the state. She trusted him with her future, her fears, and her entire life savings, unaware that he had already started the timer on his phone. December 2nd was a Friday. The temperature along the New Jersey coast hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a damp, biting wind blowing in off the Atlantic. It was the kind of gray, overcast afternoon that forced people indoors, leaving the residential streets of Neptune City largely empty. Inside a cramped apartment, a plan transitioned into active execution. The two young men synchronized their movements. The primary aggressor slipped a pair of cheap, disposable walkie-talkies into his jacket. He instructed his roommate to monitor Channel 4 and to wait for a specific signal. If the radio cracked to life, it meant the physical act was finished and the extraction phase needed to begin. The subordinate nodded, taking his position on the couch, entirely willing to wait out a murder from the comfort of his living room. The walk to the target's house took less than 10 minutes. The perpetrator texted ahead, manufacturing a casual excuse to stop by. He claimed he just wanted to hang out, maybe watch a movie and catch up. The victim, completely isolated in the quiet house while her father was away on a business trip, welcomed the company. She unlocked the front door and let her childhood friend inside. The living room was warm. The television hummed in the background. She settled onto the couch, turning her attention to the screen, completely relaxed in her own home. The predator sat beside her. He did not immediately strike. He allowed the mundane atmosphere to stretch on for several minutes, casually watching the television, monitoring the street out the front window for any passing cars. He was waiting for absolute silence. He needed to ensure no delivery drivers were walking up the driveway. He needed the perimeter to be entirely secure. When he finally moved, there was no argument. There was no sudden confrontation or shouted threat. The transition to violence was instantaneous. He lunged. He wrapped his forearm tightly around her neck from behind. He locked his grip. He applied maximum pressure to the carotid artery. The victim fought back violently. Survival instinct took over. She clawed at his arms, kicking her legs against the coffee table, gasping for a breath that would not come. The family dog, sensing the sheer terror in the room, began barking wildly, circling the violent struggle on the carpet. The attacker did not panic. He did not loosen his hold. With his free hand, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen and started the digital stopwatch. He wanted to measure the exact duration of an execution. The physical struggle was brutal and chaotic. He dragged her off the couch, using his body weight to pin her against the floorboards. The kicking slowed. Her hands dropped. The desperate, frantic clawing at his skin lost its strength. The digital numbers on the phone screen ticked upward. 1 minute, 2 minutes. He held the chokehold. He watched the timer. He maintained the crushing pressure long after her body went entirely limp, clinical, and detached, ensuring the physiological process of asphyxiation was irreversible. When the stopwatch hit 30 minutes, he finally released his grip. The room was dead silent, save for the whining of the dog. The target was eliminated. The only witness was gone. He stood up, his muscles aching from the prolonged exertion. He did not call his accomplice immediately. The logistics of a midday disposal were too risky. The sun was still up, and neighbors could easily look out their windows. Instead, he grabbed the lifeless body by the arms. He dragged her out the back door, pulling her across the freezing patio. He shoved her deep into the dense, overgrown bushes bordering the property line, covering her with loose dirt and dead branches. Then, he went to the bathroom. He washed his face. He checked his neck for scratches. He had a scheduled shift at his job, and he intended to clock in. He walked away from the house, leaving his best friend dead in the dirt, and spent the next several hours working a standard shift. He interacted with coworkers. He served customers. He maintained a perfectly flat, unremarkable demeanor. He used his employment as a rock-solid, verifiable alibi for the afternoon, operating with a level of compartmentalization that seasoned detectives would later find utterly chilling. When the shift ended in the evening, the operation resumed. He keyed the walkie-talkie. The signal was sent. The accomplice arrived at the property under the cover of darkness. The two men entered the empty house and immediately headed for the bedroom. The objective was the heavy steel lockbox. They pulled it from its hiding spot. It weighed close to 50 pounds, a dense metal cube packed with vintage, brittle currency. They carried it out the front door, loading it into the trunk of their vehicle. They did not stop to count the yield. The physical evidence of the body still needed to be addressed. They moved to the backyard. The air was frigid now, the temperature dropping sharply toward freezing. They pulled the victim from the brush. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in, making the body stiff and incredibly difficult to maneuver. They needed her own car for the staging. The faded 1992 Oldsmobile 88 was parked in the driveway. They opened the passenger door and shoved her into the front seat, buckling the seatbelt to keep her upright. The convoy mobilized just before midnight. The plan required precision driving. The mastermind took the wheel of the Oldsmobile, sitting mere inches from the corpse of the girl who had trusted him. The accomplice followed closely behind in a separate vehicle. They navigated the dark, winding coastal roads, heading directly toward the Route 35 bridge in Belmar. The traffic was non-existent. The streets were black ribbons of asphalt cutting through the sleeping coastal towns. They reached the crest of the bridge. The structure arched high over the Shark River, a 50-foot drop into fast-moving, icy currents leading out to the Atlantic Ocean. The mastermind pulled the Oldsmobile onto the narrow shoulder and slammed the transmission into park. He left the engine idling. He left the keys dangling in the ignition. The two men moved with frantic, terrified speed. The exposure on the elevated bridge was massive. Any passing patrol cruiser would see them instantly. They opened the passenger door. They unbuckled the belt. They grabbed the victim by the arms and legs, hauling her dead weight out of the cabin. The coastal wind whipped across the concrete span, freezing their hands as they dragged her toward the steel railing. They hoisted her up. The body was heavy, awkward, and rigid. They balanced her on the cold metal for a fraction of a second before pushing her forward. She fell silently into the darkness. There was a distant, heavy splash as she hit the black water below. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her out toward the ocean. The men didn't wait to watch her sink. They sprinted to the secondary vehicle, throwing themselves into the cabin. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped away from the bridge, leaving the idling Oldsmobile behind. They returned to their apartment. They locked the door. They placed the heavy steel safe on the living room table, and finally pried it open. The vintage bills spilled out onto the cheap wood grain. They spent the early hours of the morning counting the blood money, entirely convinced they had just executed the perfect crime. The idling engine of the fading sedan was the first anomaly that caught the attention of the passing patrol unit. It was the early, freezing hours of a Saturday morning. The elevated span crossing the river was entirely deserted, save for the vehicle parked haphazardly on the southbound shoulder. The hazard lights were dark. The driver's side door was shut but unlocked. The keys remained in the ignition, the engine emitting a low, steady hum against the coastal wind. Inside, the cabin was empty. Officers immediately ran the plates. The registration returned a local address just a few miles away. The patrolman leaned over the thick concrete barrier, shining high-powered tactical flashlights into the churning black water 50 feet below, searching for surface disturbances or the bright color of a winter coat. There was nothing but the relentless, foaming pull of the tide rushing out toward the Atlantic Ocean. Within hours, the quiet borough was jolted awake by the arrival of unmarked cruisers. Investigators knocked on the front door of the family home. The father, having just returned from his out-of-town trip, was met with the kind of news that permanently paralyzes a parent. He was told his vehicle had been located abandoned on a bridge notorious for fatal jumps. The authorities needed to know her state of mind. The immediate working theory adopted by law enforcement was agonizingly straightforward. A young artist, carrying the profound, unresolved trauma of losing her mother, had driven to the highest point in the county and surrendered to the freezing currents. It was a clean, logical narrative that required no complex forensic breakdown, but the father's intuition rebelled aggressively against the clinical assessment. He insisted she had been making concrete plans. She was looking toward the future, organizing a cross-country move, and sketching out a new life. The framework of a sudden suicide simply did not fit the forward momentum she had been actively building. Despite his protests, the mechanics of a massive recovery operation were initiated. Dive teams suited up in heavy thermal neoprene, plunging into the brutal 39-degree water. Visibility beneath the surface was virtually non-existent, reduced to a murky, swirling brown. Divers relied entirely on tactile navigation, feeling their way along the muddy, debris-filled riverbed, fighting against a rip current that constantly threatened to pull them out to sea. Above them, Coast Guard helicopters chopped through the gray winter sky, flying low grid patterns over the inlet, while Marine units dragged high-frequency sonar equipment across the harbor floor. Days dragged into weeks. The water yielded absolutely nothing. As the official search expanded, the social echo within the tight-knit community grew deafening. The coastal towns mobilized with a frantic, grassroots energy. Thousands of residents who had never even spoken to the missing teenager began printing stacks of flyers. They taped them to the glass doors of local diners, stapled them to utility poles, and handed them out to drivers at red lights. Digital campaigns multiplied across social networks, tracking alleged sightings that led nowhere. The psychological atmosphere of the town shifted from routine winter quiet to a suffocating communal dread. Right in the center of this mobilization were the two men who had orchestrated the nightmare. The mastermind did not retreat into the shadows or avoid the spotlight. Instead, he embedded himself perfectly within the epicenter of the grieving community. He adopted the flawless persona of a devastated, desperate friend. He showed up at the house, standing shoulder to shoulder with the shattered father. He offered a comforting physical presence, pouring coffee for relatives, fielding phone calls, and helping coordinate civilian search parties. He walked the icy beaches, bundled in a heavy winter coat, pretending to scan the horizon for a body he personally knew had already washed out to the ocean. His performance was entirely devoid of the micro-expressions of guilt that usually betray a killer. He spoke with local media outlets, providing poignant quotes about her infectious laugh and her artistic talent, weaponizing his long history with her to validate his fabricated grief. He suggested to anyone who would listen that perhaps she really had buckled under the weight of her depression, subtly reinforcing the police's initial theory. He actively steered the narrative, planting careful seeds of doubt to ensure the investigative focus remained squarely on the river and far away from his own apartment. His roommate mirrored this chilling sociopathy. He participated in the very searches he knew were utterly futile. He watched community volunteers weep over a tragedy that he had facilitated for a meager cut of stolen cash. They both operated in broad daylight, surrounded by law enforcement and grieving relatives, absolutely confident in their own untouchability. But the river's persistent refusal to surrender a body began to create a localized friction. The physical reality of the waterways presented a severe logistical problem for the suicide theory. The tides in that specific inlet were strong, but the basin was enclosed enough that recovery teams usually located jump victims within a predictable radius. A human form hitting the water from that height would likely have snagged on the submerged concrete pylons or washed up along the immediate shoreline within a week. The total, prolonged absence of physical evidence slowly eroded the certainty of a fatal leap. Paranoia began to circulate. The faded flyers on the utility poles took on a more sinister context. The community, initially united in a rescue effort, started to fracture under the weight of unanswerable questions. If the freezing water hadn't taken her, the only remaining alternative was that someone on land had. The father refused to let the momentum die. He organized a massive volunteer search at a nearby state park, drawing hundreds of locals who spent their weekends trudging through dense, frozen brush. The mastermind attended that search too. He stood in a wide circle of shivering volunteers, bowing his head respectfully during a moment of silent prayer, a predator resting comfortably among the flock. He was simply waiting for the calendar to turn, waiting for the town's energy to deplete, entirely certain that the truth was buried under 50 feet of dark water and a perfectly executed lie. Without a body, a secondary crime scene, or a hostile witness, the detectives were forced to navigate an agonizing maze of dead ends. They pulled financial records, searching for sudden bank withdrawals or transportation ticket purchases that might suggest the 19-year-old had successfully executed her cross-country escape. The accounts were entirely dormant. They analyzed cellular tower pings, but the data only confirmed her phone went dead near the bridge. The investigative team conducted routine, procedural interviews with the victim's inner circle. The childhood friend who had aggressively helped coordinate the civilian search parties sat across from seasoned interrogators and delivered a flawless, practiced performance. He offered them the exact narrative they were already leaning toward, painting a highly believable portrait of a grieving daughter who simply cracked under the relentless psychological weight of her mother's death. He maintained steady eye contact. He controlled his breathing. The detectives filed his statement without a second thought. He was documented as a highly cooperative witness, an asset to the inquiry, rather than a target. The investigation essentially stalled, frozen in the winter ice. The pivotal breakthrough did not come from advanced forensic analysis or a sudden shift in the ocean currents. It came from a delayed crisis of conscience. In late January 2017, nearly 2 months after the idling Oldsmobile was found, a local 19-year-old named Anthony Curry walked into a police precinct. He was an amateur filmmaker, known around the borough for producing independent horror shorts. He carried a heavy, terrifying burden. He explained to the detectives that weeks prior to the disappearance, he had engaged in a casual conversation with an acquaintance. The acquaintance had pitched what sounded like a gritty script idea for for a new movie. The concept involved a plot to strangle a wealthy female friend, steal a heavy lockbox filled with inherited cash, and stage the aftermath by throwing the body off the Route 35 bridge to simulate a suicide. At the time, the filmmaker assumed it was just macabre creative brainstorming. He brushed it off as dark fiction. But when the exact, highly specific parameters of that pitch manifested in reality, the theoretical horror morphed into undeniable panic. He gave the authorities the name of the aspiring screenwriter. It was the same helpful, grieving friend who had been handing out missing person flyers at the local diners. Detectives recognized the extreme fragility of the situation. A bizarre conversation about a hypothetical movie plot was entirely circumstantial. It was not sufficient for a murder indictment, especially in a jurisdiction operating without a corpse. They needed the predator to voluntarily incriminate himself on the record, completely unaware that his audience had changed. The investigative team approached the filmmaker and proposed a high-risk sting operation. They needed him to act as human bait. On January 31st, technicians meticulously rigged the informant's personal vehicle with concealed, high-definition audiovisual recording equipment. Pinhole lenses were embedded into the dashboard and the interior upholstery, capturing every possible angle of the passenger seat. Microphones were calibrated to cut through engine noise and pick up the faintest whispers. The informant was instructed to invite the target into the car under the guise of catching up, to drive aimlessly around the dark coastal streets, and to subtly steer the conversation toward the missing girl. The psychological pressure on the young informant was immense. He had to sit mere inches away from a man he now believed was a calculating killer, maintaining a relaxed, casual demeanor while transmitting audio directly to a nearby surveillance van packed with federal agents. The target opened the passenger door and slid into the wired vehicle. The trap was set. What the detectives heard over the live feed over the next hour was a masterclass in detached sociopathy. The suspect did not need to be aggressively prodded or skillfully interrogated. He wanted to brag. He viewed the murder not as a horrific moral transgression, but as a supreme logistical triumph. He was deeply proud of his operational genius, and he was eager to share the mechanics of his success with someone he considered a creative peer. Over the hidden microphones, investigators listened in stunned silence as the young man systematically dismantled his own alibi. He provided the gruesome, granular details of the afternoon ambush. He described the exact 30-minute duration he had monitored on his phone while he applied the chokehold in her living room. He detailed the victim's frantic, desperate struggle, noting with absolute coldness how the family dog had barked chaotically in the background. The audio feed captured him complaining about the sheer physical exertion required to drag a dead weight out the back door and shove it into the frozen dirt. He casually outlined how his roommate had monitored the walkie-talkie and helped haul the corpse onto the concrete span of the bridge. But the psychological core of the confession was not guilt. It was profound financial grievance. He complained bitterly to the informant that the massive payout he had anticipated was a total mirage. The heavy steel safe did not contain the estimated $100,000 he had calculated. The total yield barely broke $10,000. Adding to his intense frustration, the vintage bills were in terrible condition, sticky, brittle, and smelling of mildew. He admitted to burning a large portion of the older currency in a fire pit because he feared the outdated serial numbers would flag suspicion at the local bank tellers. He had snapped the neck of his closest childhood friend, destroyed multiple families, and risked a lethal injection, all for a few $1,000s in decaying, unusable paper. He actually laughed through the dashboard speakers, remarking on the bitter irony of the poor payout and mocking the victim for not fighting back harder during her execution. The detective sitting in the surveillance van had heard enough. The meticulous, grieving friend facade was permanently shattered on digital tape. The administrative paperwork for a double arrest was initiated before the suspect even stepped out of the wired car. The arrests were executed simultaneously. Faced with the overwhelming weight of the surveillance tape, the subordinate immediately fractured. He accepted a plea agreement, formally turning state's evidence in exchange for a capped prison term of 18 years. He physically guided detectives back to the precise locations of the ambush and the bridge, confirming every terrifying logistical detail captured on the wire, though the ocean never returned the physical evidence. The 2019 legal proceedings presented a notoriously difficult hurdle for prosecutors, securing a homicide conviction without a corpse. The defense attorneys attempted a massive pivot. They argued the dashboard confession was nothing more than an elaborate, fabricated audition tape, a dark performance piece created specifically for the informant's upcoming film project. It was a desperate strategy that completely collapsed the moment the jury heard the audio. The sheer, banal cruelty of the defendant's voice resonating through the courtroom, complaining about the degraded quality of the vintage bills while casually verifying the stopwatch timing of the strangulation, eliminated all reasonable doubt. He was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, and permanently removed from society with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The Shark River never surrendered the physical remains to the tide, but the lasting horror of this case does not rest in the freezing currents or an empty steel lockbox. It resides in those final, suffocating minutes on a living room floor. She did not perish fighting off an anonymous intruder in the dark. She spent her last conscious moments staring into the eyes of the boy who had sworn to protect her, dying with the profound realization that her survival meant absolutely nothing to him. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. It is midnight during a brutal Utah blizzard, temperatures plummeting below freezing. Inside a silent suburban home, a woman's purse, keys, and phone sit untouched on the kitchen counter. A carpet fan hums in the living room, slowly drying 2 wet spots on the floor. Yet, her husband tells investigators a story defying all logic. He claims he just packed their 2 toddlers into a minivan and drove into the pitch-black, sub-zero desert to go camping. He returned. She did not. This is a descent into a meticulously documented nightmare. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Susan Cox was born into an environment defined by community, structure, and faith. Raised in Puyallup, Washington, her daily life revolved around the local LDS ward. Her personality acted as a natural magnet, bubbly, meticulously organized, and unfailingly optimistic. She was the woman who remembered every obscure anniversary, organized neighborhood events, and possessed a loud, infectious laugh that could cut through a crowded room. Professionally, she worked as a cosmetologist. The busy, chatty atmosphere of a hair salon perfectly suited her highly social nature, allowing her to connect with dozens of people daily. Yet behind this bright, outward-facing exterior lay a singular, unwavering life goal. She desperately wanted to build a traditional, loving family unit, grounded in her religious convictions. She envisioned the quiet stability of a suburban home, a devoted husband, and children to raise in her faith. It was a simple, culturally ingrained ambition, one that ultimately made her deeply vulnerable. Josh Powell emerged from a fundamentally different reality. He presented himself as a quiet, somewhat socially awkward young man attending church singles activities. He wore the standard attire, spoke the right vocabulary, and projected the image of a faithful member looking for a wife. But this religious devotion was entirely manufactured, a social camouflage worn to infiltrate a community he privately did not respect. The true architect of Josh's psychological framework was his father, Stephen Powell. To understand the man Susan would marry, one must examine the deeply insular, suffocating environment Stephen cultivated inside his own home. Stephen was a domineering, intellectually arrogant figure who openly mocked organized religion. He demanded absolute cult-like reverence from his children. Inside his house, the atmosphere was heavily policed. Stephen viewed women primarily as objects of visual consumption and possession, a profoundly toxic ideology he systematically passed down to his sons. He obsessively documented his surroundings, frequently carrying a camcorder and keeping meticulous, inappropriate journals, a habit of constant surveillance that normalized extreme invasions of privacy for his boys. Within that family dynamic, normal boundaries simply did not exist. Stephen engineered a system where his children were utterly dependent on him for emotional validation. He pitted the siblings against one another, rewarding absolute loyalty and ruthlessly punishing independent thought. The Powell boys were taught that the outside world was inherently hostile, ignorant, and inferior. Only the patriarch could be trusted. Josh absorbed these lessons down to his marrow. He learned to weaponize silence. He was conditioned to view relationships as transactional and to assert dominance not through physical force, but through relentless, passive-aggressive manipulation. While Susan was raised to build bridges with her community, Josh was trained from infancy to burn them, isolate his targets, and hoard control. When the two crossed paths at a church function in 2000, the collision of their worlds was entirely masked. Susan was a trusting, eager 20-year-old looking for a partner to fulfill her familial dreams. Josh, several years older, was a socially stunted observer armed with a rigid, patriarchal worldview. Susan saw a reserved, devout man who just needed drawing out of his shell. She could not perceive that Josh was operating as a direct extension of Stephen's oppressive ideologies. The courtship moved with alarming speed. Josh mirrored her religious enthusiasm just long enough to satisfy her baseline expectations. He suppressed his inherited misogyny, playing the role of a supportive, albeit quiet, fiancé. They married in April 2001. The wedding was celebrated as the beginning of a beautiful, traditional life. In reality, the foundation of their union was built on a calculated deception, locking a vibrant young woman into a psychological siege that would quietly escalate over the next 8 years. The illusion of a traditional marriage evaporated within months of the ceremony. Once the certificate was filed, the quiet, agreeable facade melted away, replaced by a rigid obsession with control. The initial battleground was not physical, it was financial. Despite holding down steady employment at the salon, the young wife was systematically stripped of all access to her own earnings. Her paychecks were deposited into accounts she could not access. Purchasing basic necessities required submission to a grueling, demeaning interrogation. She had to justify the cost of groceries, toiletries, and clothing, often facing severe reprimands for spending a few extra cents. This financial strangulation was a deliberate mechanism of isolation, designed to make her entirely dependent on a husband who viewed her not as a partner, but as an acquired asset to be managed. In 2004, the couple relocated to Washington State, moving directly into the home of her father-in-law. This environment was immediately suffocating. The house was a cluttered, oppressive space where the patriarch's word was absolute law. The air always felt heavy, thick with unspoken tensions, and the constant, unnatural feeling of being watched. Normal boundaries simply did not exist within those walls. The patriarch's behavior quickly shifted from overbearing to overtly predatory. He developed a deep, unnatural fixation on his daughter-in-law. It started with small, invasive actions, spiriting away her undergarments from the laundry room and hoarding them in his private quarters. Then, the camcorder, a staple in that surveillance-heavy household, was weaponized against her. He would secretly film her from behind while she washed dishes, folded clothes, or watched television. He would zoom in on her body, muttering explicit commentary under his breath. This relentless stalking culminated in a deeply disturbing private confrontation. He cornered her in the house, confessing a severe sexual infatuation and insisting they were meant to be together, completely disregarding the fact that she was married to his own son. Terrified and disgusted, she took the encounter to her husband, desperate for a protector. She received nothing but cold apathy. He did not confront his father. He did not defend his wife. He essentially shrugged off the predatory behavior, implying that the older man's actions were normal, or worse, that she had somehow invited the unwanted attention. This betrayal fractured something permanent in the relationship. She realized then that she was completely alone, trapped in an isolated family ecosystem that operated on a perverse set of rules. She was not a wife to be protected, she was property. Desperate to escape the predatory environment of the Washington house, she orchestrated a move to West Valley City, Utah. The physical distance provided a temporary illusion of relief, and the subsequent births of their 2 young boys shifted her focus entirely to motherhood. But the change in geography did not change the man she married. Without his father's daily influence, He simply adopted the patriarch's role entirely. His psychological manipulation evolved. He began aggressively attacking her faith, the very foundation of her identity, mocking her beliefs and forbidding her from bringing the children to church services. He wanted to sever her final tie to the outside community. His financial grip tightened to absurd punitive levels. He canceled her health insurance without telling her, leaving her vulnerable. In the dead of winter, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, he refused to let her use the family minivan. Instead, he forced her to commute to her salon job on a bicycle. She spent mornings pedaling through heavy snow and ice, fingers numb, while the vehicle sat completely unused in their driveway. It was a calculated humiliation designed to break her spirit. He dictated exactly what she could eat, complaining endlessly about the cost of food while secretly hoarding resources and spending money on expensive power tools for himself. The isolation was nearly complete. She was exhausted, financially ruined, and emotionally battered. By 2008, her situational anxiety morphed into a cold, terrifying certainty. She knew he was capable of violence, even if he had never left a visible bruise. Recognizing that her life was in active danger, she began taking covert steps to protect herself and her children. She secretly opened an independent bank account. She rented a hidden safe deposit box at a local branch, paying for it in cash so there would be no paper trail. Then, she picked up a handheld digital camera. Hiding in her home office, listening intently for the sound of his heavy footsteps on the stairs, she hit record. The faint glow of the LCD screen illuminated her pale, exhausted face in the darkened room. Speaking in hurried, hushed tones, she documented the psychological abuse, the financial ruin, and the escalating, unspoken threats. She compiled a hidden file containing a handwritten will, explicitly stating that if she were to die, it would not be an accident. She detailed his volatile temper and his absolute refusal to grant a divorce. She locked the tapes, the will, and her private journals inside the safe deposit box. She was methodically laying down a breadcrumb trail from the grave, knowing that when the time came, her voice would need to survive her. Sunday, December 6th. The Salt Lake Valley sat trapped under a thick inversion layer, the grim precursor to a massive winter storm moving in from the northwest. The temperature hovered in the low 30s, the air sharp and biting. Inside the split-level home on Sarah Circle, the morning unfolded with an eerie, mundane precision. The wife dressed her two young boys, wrestling them into their heavy winter coats, and drove the short distance to their local LDS ward. She thrived in this environment. She moved through the chapel corridors with purpose, organizing playdates, chatting with neighbors, and anchoring herself in the community. She was highly visible. Her husband remained at home. He preferred the enclosed, controlled environment of his home office, the glow of the computer monitor, and the absolute silence of an empty house. By early afternoon, the mother and sons returned to Sarah Circle. The sky outside had bruised to a deep, heavy purple. The wind picked up, whistling through the bare branches of the suburban trees and rattling the frosted window panes. A female friend from the congregation arrived shortly after for a casual visit. The presence of a guest forced a temporary truce upon the household. The women sat together in the living room, discussing holiday plans while the boys played on the carpet. But as the afternoon bled into the early evening, the atmosphere inside the home began to subtly fracture. The husband, a man who meticulously avoided domestic labor, suddenly inserted himself into the routine. He announced he was making dinner. He moved around the cramped kitchen with a bizarre, focused, manic energy, preparing a batch of homemade pancakes. The heavy scent of hot cooking oil and sweet batter filled the room, masking the underlying tension. He served a plate directly to his wife. She ate while sitting on the couch next to her friend. The physiological reaction was almost immediate. A profound, unnatural lethargy washed over her. The vibrant, highly social woman who had been organizing community events just hours earlier suddenly could not keep her eyes open. Her words began to drag. Her limbs felt weighted with lead. She repeatedly mentioned feeling dizzy and overwhelmingly exhausted. Unable to fight the sudden chemical heaviness pulling her down, she excused herself, walked unsteadily down the short hallway, and collapsed into her bed. She was asleep within minutes, fully clothed. The visiting friend noted the abrupt physical decline. It was strange, unsettling, but entirely out of context for a suburban Sunday evening. Assuming it was merely sudden fatigue, the friend gathered her coat around 5 p.m., stepped out into the freezing driveway, and drove away. The front door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaged, the house was sealed. What transpired inside the walls of Sarah's Circle over the next 7.5 hours remains a terrifying reconstruction of physical evidence and missing logic. Outside, the promised winter storm slammed into the valley. Heavy, wet snow began to fall in blinding sheets. The barometric pressure plummeted, and the wind chill dropped toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the home, the silence of the evening was broken by the aggressive, mechanical roar of industrial equipment. 2 distinct wet patches soaked the living room carpet, directly adjacent to the couch where the wife had eaten her meal. The synthetic fibers had been vigorously scrubbed. A large, high-velocity carpet fan was pulled into the center of the room and plugged directly into the wall. Its motor whined continuously, blasting cold air across the damp spots, filling the enclosed space with the sharp, sterile chemical odor of heavy-duty upholstery cleaner. A few feet away, illuminated by the harsh overhead fluorescent light of the kitchen, sat a visual paradox. The wife's heavy winter coat remained draped over a dining chair. Her purse rested squarely on the laminate counter. Inside the leather bag were her car keys, her wallet, her identification, and her cell phone. Her entire logistical lifeline to the outside world remained perfectly undisturbed, bathed in the artificial kitchen light, while the storm raged against the glass. Midnight approached. The tension in the narrative violently spikes here. According to the husband's official timeline, he looked out the window at the swirling blizzard, noted the sub-zero temperatures, and decided this was the optimal moment for a spontaneous family camping trip. He did not wake his deeply sedated wife. He did not pack her winter gear. He did not leave a note. Instead, he moved into the boys' bedroom. He lifted the 2 sleeping toddlers, aged 2 and 4, from their warm beds. He carried them, limp and drowsy, out the front door and into the biting, freezing wind of the driveway. He strapped them into their car seats in the back of the family minivan. He loaded a small, gas-powered portable generator, a few blankets, and some plastic snow sleds into the back cargo area. The sheer logistical madness of this action defies all basic human instinct. Loading small, vulnerable children into a freezing vehicle at 12:30 a.m. during a severe winter weather advisory without notifying their mother is a scenario completely devoid of reason. The minivan's engine turned over. The headlights cut a narrow, swirling path through the heavy snowfall. The vehicle backed out of the driveway, tires crunching loudly over the accumulating ice, leaving the brightly lit, humming house behind. The route taken was an intentional dive into absolute desolation. The minivan rolled through the empty, snow-packed streets of West Valley City, bypassing the safety of the interstate. It headed south along State Route 36, driving deeper into the pitch-black void of the Tooele County perimeter. The destination was not a commercial campground with facilities, lighting, or park rangers. The destination was Simpson Springs. Simpson Springs sits in the remote heart of the West Desert along the historic Pony Express Trail. It is a harsh, unforgiving expanse of rugged dirt, jagged rock formations, and low-lying sagebrush. In the summer, it is an arid oven. In the dead of winter, during a blizzard, it is a lethal, freezing wasteland, entirely exposed to high-velocity winds. The drive took over 2 hours. The paved highway eventually ran out, giving way to deeply rutted, unmaintained dirt tracks. The minivan slid and clawed its way over miles of ice-covered gravel. Out here, the darkness is absolute. There is no ambient city glow to light the horizon. The snow drove horizontally across the windshield, mesmerizing and blinding. The temperature gauge on the dashboard registered single digits. There are no cell phone towers in the West Desert. There are no gas stations, no emergency call boxes, no passing patrols. If a vehicle breaks down on that remote dirt track in December, the occupants are in immediate, life-threatening danger from severe exposure. Yet, the minivan pushed forward into the blackness. The heater blasted inside the cabin, keeping the sleeping toddlers warm while the frozen landscape rolled past the windows. He claimed they arrived at the desolate campsite, set up the small generator in the deep snow, aimed a space heater at the boys, and slept in the front seat, while the blizzard hammered the metal chassis of the van. He claimed this was a normal family outing. He claimed he sat in the freezing darkness of a desert wasteland, surrounded by miles of empty, frozen earth, simply watching the snow fall. He claimed his wife was sleeping safely in her bed 50 miles away, but the purse remained on the counter. The fan continued to blast air over the damp, chemical-soaked carpet, and the sun was beginning to rise on a Monday morning where nothing would ever be the same again. Monday morning breaks over the snow-choked Salt Lake Valley. The temperature remains brutal, the sky a flat, unbroken gray. Miles away from the desolate expanse of the West Desert, the missing woman's alarm clock rings unanswered in the empty master bedroom. At 9 a.m., her desk at the local bank branch remains empty. This immediate deviation from her rigid professional routine triggers the first wave of institutional concern. She was a woman who lived entirely by the calendar and the clock. Missing a shift without a phone call was a severe anomaly that completely contradicted her psychological profile. Simultaneously, a local daycare provider notices the absence of the two toddlers. The morning drop-off window closes. Calls to both parents' cell phones ring endlessly before dropping to voicemail. Recognizing the extreme irregularity, the provider escalates the situation, contacting the emergency numbers listed on the boys' enrollment forms. The husband's mother and sister-in-law are notified. They drive slowly through the icy, unplowed streets to the split-level home on Sarah Circle, arriving to find the driveway buried in fresh powder and the front door locked tight. The windows are heavily frosted over from the inside, revealing nothing of the interior. Feeling a sharp spike of dread, they dial the authorities. West Valley City police officers arrive shortly after noon to conduct a standard welfare check. They pound heavily on the front door. Absolute silence answers them. They circle the perimeter of the property, heavy boots crunching loudly through the deep snow. Finding a side window secured but vulnerable, an officer breaks the glass, reaches through the jagged opening, and unlocks the frame. Stepping inside, the officers are immediately hit by a wall of warm, stagnant air and a bizarre auditory backdrop. The house is completely still, save for the relentless, mechanical whine of the industrial carpet fan spinning in the center of the living room. The sensory anchors in the space paint a disjointed, deeply alarming picture. There is the sharp, undeniable stench of chemical upholstery, cleaner cutting through the stale, heated air. The synthetic carpet fibers directly beneath the spinning fan blades are cold and damp to the touch. Moving into the kitchen, bathed in the dull afternoon light filtering through the snow-dusted windows, investigators find the ultimate paradox. The missing woman's leather purse rests squarely on the laminate counter. Inside, officers find her wallet, her identification, her car keys, and her cell phone. Her heavy winter coat remains draped precisely over the back of a dining room chair. Her entire logistical lifeline to the outside world is sitting exactly where she left it. The house is completely intact, but the family has vanished. The initial theory leans toward a catastrophic accident. Perhaps the family packed into the minivan to escape a malfunctioning furnace and succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning on the road. Perhaps they slid off an icy embankment into a hidden ravine during the height of the blizzard. Detectives immediately request emergency pings on the husband's cell phone, but the network registers the device as completely powered down. He is effectively a ghost, operating entirely off the grid while a massive winter storm buries the state. By mid-afternoon, the quiet suburban street transforms into a staging ground. Marked cruisers idle loudly along the curb, their exhaust plumes thick in the freezing air. Crime scene tape is unspooled across the frozen lawn. Detectives move methodically through the home, photographing the damp carpet spots, the untouched winter gear, and the eerie absence of any physical struggle. The house is too clean. The fan simply hums on. The waiting game stretches into the early evening. The sun dips below the Oquirrh Mountains, plunging the neighborhood back into sub-zero darkness. Then, at approximately 5 p.m., a blue minivan slowly turns onto Sarah Circle. The vehicle pulls into the driveway, its engine ticking as it idles, instantly flanked by uniformed officers and glaring police spotlights. The driver's side door opens. The husband steps out into the freezing air. The narrative pacing halts. He is not frantic. He is not hyperventilating. He exhibits zero physical signs of panic, adrenaline, or distress. He calmly observes the armada of police vehicles surrounding his property. When confronted by investigators demanding to know the whereabouts of his wife, his reaction defies all fundamental human psychology. He offers a slight, confused shrug. He casually informs the bewildered detectives that he assumed it was Sunday. He claims he simply lost track of the days while out camping in the desert and thought she was at work. The officers stare at him in disbelief. They point out the severe blizzard conditions that paralyzed the region overnight. They note the lethal temperatures. They extract the two small boys from the rear of the van, children who appear grimy and exhausted but uninjured. The husband maintains a flat, apathetic affect. He insists he'd left the house shortly after midnight, driving through the blinding storm to set up a generator in the frozen dirt of Simpson Springs, specifically to test out new camping gear. Investigators press him on the fatal flaw in his logic. They ask why his wife's purse, keys, and phone are locked inside the house if she had gone to her bank job. He offers no logical response, only a detached, mild surprise. He does not ask if she has been found. He does not plead for the police to launch a search party. His primary concern, expressed while standing in his driveway as his family unit fractures permanently, is whether he can go inside the house to get warm. Word of the disappearance detonates across the West Valley city community. The local LDS ward, tightly knit and deeply invested in the missing woman's life, mobilizes overnight. Command centers are rapidly established in church gymnasiums. Volunteers print thousands of missing person flyers, taping them to telephone poles, gas station windows, and grocery store bulletin boards. The social echo is visceral. Fear permeates the neighborhood. Initially, the community fears a random abduction, a violent predator stalking the quiet, snow-covered streets. But as details of the husband's bizarre midnight camping trip inevitably leak to the public, the collective dread sharply shifts focus. The monster was not an unknown drifter. The threat had been living quietly inside the house on Sarah Circle. Rumors ignite across local forums and neighborhood watch networks. Parishioners who had spoken to the missing woman just 24 hours earlier struggle to reconcile her vibrant energy with the desolate void she left behind. They organize grid searches, trudging through waist-deep snowbanks along the foothills, driven by a desperate need to find her before the freezing temperatures claim any chance of survival. Meanwhile, the husband actively distances himself from the massive volunteer effort. He does not distribute flyers. He does not attend the emotional candlelight vigils. He locks the doors of his house, draws the heavy blinds, and retreats into the solitary glow of his computer monitor, leaving the terrified community to search the frozen wasteland entirely alone. The interrogation room was deliberately cramped, the air sterile and perfectly temperature controlled to induce a subtle physical discomfort. Detectives sat across from the husband, watching his physiological responses with intense scrutiny. He did not exhibit the frantic, vibrating energy typical of a man whose family had just been torn apart. Instead, he slouched deeply into the hard plastic chair, offering vague, non-committal murmurs. When pressed on the glaring logistical impossibilities of his midnight desert excursion, he simply deflected. He complained about the harsh fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead. He requested a glass of water, his hand perfectly steady as he took a sip. He absolutely refused to make prolonged eye contact. Then, recognizing the tactical disadvantage of continuing the conversation, he calmly invoked his right to legal counsel. The invisible wall of silence crashed down, engineered by a lifetime of psychological conditioning. Law enforcement immediately pivoted their vast resources to the hostile expanse of Simpson Springs. The West Desert swallowed the massive search effort whole. Dozens of tactical officers, specialized cadaver dog units, and off-road vehicles combed through the frozen sagebrush. The psychological toll of searching this absolute void was immense. Detectives chased phantoms across the ice. The air smelled of aviation fuel as helicopters ran low-level grid patterns, their rotors kicking up blinding clouds of white powder. Footprints found near a remote limestone ridge sent a sudden surge of adrenaline through the mobile command center, only for forensic analysts to match the tread pattern to a local rancher's utility truck 3 days later. It was a crushing dead end. They shifted their focus to the region's hundreds of undocumented, abandoned mining shafts. Tactical teams anchored heavy winch systems into the frozen earth, dropping high-definition fiber-optic cameras down narrow, 100-foot vertical drops. The operators stared intently at the glowing monitors inside their heated vans. They found nothing but stagnant black water, rusted machinery, and jagged, dead rock. The sheer geographic scale of the Utah wilderness had morphed into the primary antagonist, actively fighting the investigation at every turn. While the police force was freezing in the high desert, the husband executed a highly calculated logistical maneuver. He secured a compact rental car. Over the next 48 hours, while his own property remained cordoned off by yellow crime scene tape, he logged nearly 800 miles on the sedan's digital odometer. When finally questioned about this massive discrepancy, he claimed he was simply driving the local valley grid, desperately looking for his missing spouse. Experienced detectives knew this was a mathematical absurdity. 800 miles provided the exact geographical range needed to cross into several neighboring states, navigate remote logging roads, and return. Investigators theorized this critical window was used to execute the final phase of his plan, moving the primary evidence from a temporary staging ground to a permanent, undiscoverable grave. Back at the split-level home, forensics systematically dismantled the interior. Technicians sprayed the floorboards with chemical reagents, plunging the living room into darkness to hunt for the telltale blue luminescent glow of hidden proteins. The damp sections of the rug, the exact areas dried by the whining industrial fan, yielded microscopic traces of human blood. DNA analysis quickly matched the sample to the missing woman. It was a minimal amount, completely insufficient to legally prove a fatal event in a court of law, but more than enough to obliterate the husband's camping trip narrative. His blue minivan was subsequently impounded and processed. The enclosed cabin smelled overwhelmingly of harsh, pine-scented chemical solvents. The upholstery on the front passenger seat had been heavily scrubbed, the fibers stiff and distorted from bleach. Sensing the tightening investigative net, the husband packed his remaining belongings, loaded the two toddlers, and fled across state lines under the cover of darkness. He retreated to the oppressive, insular safety of his father's home in Washington state. This maneuver forced the investigation to radically adapt, requiring Utah detectives to navigate complex interstate jurisdictions, secure federal assistance, and cut through sluggish bureaucratic red tape. The case ground into a grueling psychological war of attrition. Months dragged into years. Detectives meticulously built their probable cause, finally securing a comprehensive multi-agency search warrant for the patriarch's residence in Puyallup. The subsequent raid was executed with clinical, overwhelming precision. Tactical units breached the cluttered, suffocating home at dawn. What they uncovered inside the physical and electronic archives was the manifestation of a deeply sick psychological environment. They seized thousands of digital files, dozens of hard drives, and stacks of meticulously indexed handwritten journals. Investigators sat in darkened viewing rooms for weeks, grimly cataloging the seized media. They watched endless hours of grainy camcorder footage filmed entirely by the father-in-law. The sheer volume of voyeuristic material targeting his own daughter-in-law was staggering. The digital cache completely validated every terrified whisper the victim had recorded in her own hidden diaries years earlier. The patriarchal sickness of the family was laid bare, documented by their own hands. This massive discovery violently shifted the legal landscape. The father-in-law was arrested and eventually convicted on severe felony charges completely unrelated to the disappearance, but fundamentally tied to his predatory, obsessive nature. The ultimate enabler had been removed from the board. With the patriarch incarcerated, Child Protective Services immediately moved to extract the two young boys from the toxic environment. Temporary legal custody was awarded to the victims' parents. The children, however, were already severely traumatized. They exhibited deeply disturbing, highly conditioned behaviors learned inside the Washington house, instinctively hoarding food and flinching at loud noises. During routine psychological evaluations, the older boy began making fragmented, chilling statements to licensed caseworkers. He casually mentioned taking a long ride in the dark. He stated flatly that his mother was sleeping in the trunk. He described her coming with them to the freezing desert. but told the therapists she decided to stay out there, hidden deep in the crystal holes. The innocent, childlike phrasing masked a terrifying reality. Detectives scrambled to analyze his words, cross-referencing maps to match his descriptions to specific geological formations, limestone caves, or geode beds in the West Desert. But a traumatized child's perception of distance, time, and direction is severely distorted. The coordinates were permanently lost in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The husband recognized his absolute control was slipping. Stripped of his primary enabler, facing relentless national media scrutiny, and rapidly losing his legal grip on the children, his psychological framework began to collapse. The state family court mandated that his visitation rights be strictly supervised by an external social worker. He could no longer isolate and program his sons. The legal walls were closing in rapidly, backing a dangerous, control-obsessed narcissist into a corner, and setting the stage for a final, catastrophic assertion of dominance. Sunday, February 5th. The supervised visitation took place at a rented home in Graham. The caseworker parked and escorted the boys toward the porch. They ran ahead. The front door opened. The children crossed the threshold. Then, it violently slammed shut. The brass deadbolt clicked. The caseworker stood stranded. She hammered on the frame, demanding entry. Silence. Moving to the front window, she detected a suffocating chemical odor seeping through the glass seals. Raw gasoline. Retreating to the driveway, she frantically contacted emergency dispatch, reporting the lockout and the overpowering stench of accelerant. Inside the sealed perimeter, the final act of absolute control commenced. The man did not simply pour fuel. He armed himself with a hatchet, inflicting fatal trauma to the heads of his own sons. He ensured they would never heal and never speak in a courtroom. Then he ignited the vapors. The explosion shattered the neighborhood. A shockwave blew the windows outward in a shower of jagged debris. The roof physically separated from the structural beams, collapsing into a roaring column of flame. The fire burned with such intense heat that arriving crews were forced to simply watch the framing disintegrate. When the ash finally cooled, dental records were required to identify the bodies. He had erased the final living links to his missing wife, permanently dragging the truth into the flames. There is no conventional justice here, no courtroom verdict, no prison sentence. Just a scorched foundation in Washington and a frozen expanse in the Utah desert that refuses to yield its secrets. The family Susan fought so desperately to build was dismantled by the exact toxic control she tried to escape. Her parents were left navigating an infinite void, mourning a daughter and 2 grandsons used as final pawns. The West Desert remains completely silent. As winter winds scour the jagged limestone of Simpson Springs, the earth holds on to the truth, leaving behind only the terrifying reality of absolute ownership. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.